The stagecoach door swung open, and Cade Rockwell's entire carefully ordered world shattered in an instant. He'd placed one advertisement. One. For a housekeeper, a single woman to cook and clean in exchange for wages and shelter. What stepped down onto his Texas ranch wasn't what he'd bargained for. Violet Sloan emerged first, mud-splattered and exhausted, her dark eyes holding secrets he couldn't yet name. But it was what came next that stopped his heart cold. Two little girls, no more than 5 and 7, clutching her skirts like lifelines, their wide eyes reflecting a terror he recognized all too well. Before we begin this journey through the storm-swept Texas frontier, I invite you to stay with us until the very end. If this story moves you, please hit that like button and comment with your city so I can see just how far Violet and Cade's story travels. Now, let's step back to where it all began. The spring of 1882 arrived in Central Texas like an unwelcome guest, loud, insistent, and impossible to ignore. Storm clouds had been building since dawn, stacking themselves against the western horizon in shades of bruised purple and slate gray. By afternoon, they'd swallowed the sun whole. Cade Rockwell stood on the wide porch of his ranch house, one shoulder propped against a rough-hewn post, watching the distant road with the patient intensity of a man accustomed to solitude. The wind carried the smell of rain and cedar, whipping his dark hair across his forehead. He didn't bother pushing it back. His gray eyes, the color of winter smoke, remained fixed on the ribbon of dirt that wound through his property, past the cottonwoods, toward the main house. The stagecoach was late. Not unusual, given the weather, but it grated against his sense of order nonetheless. Cade had built his life on predictability, on the reliable rhythm of cattle, land, and honest work. He'd placed that advertisement in the Austin newspaper 6 weeks ago with specific parameters. Housekeeper wanted, single woman, room and board provided, reasonable wages, domestic skills required. Apply in writing. He'd received exactly 3 responses. 2 were barely literate. The third came from a Miss Violet Sloan of San Antonio, written in a careful, educated hand that suggested either genuine refinement or skillful forgery. Her letter had been brief, professional, and curiously devoid of personal detail. She could cook, she could clean, she could manage a household. She required immediate placement and asked no questions about wages or conditions. That last part should have raised flags. In Cade's experience, people who didn't ask questions were usually running from answers. But he'd been desperate. The house had fallen into a state of benign neglect since his housekeeper, Mrs. Garrett, had moved to Austin to live with her daughter the previous winter. Cade had managed well enough on his own. He was a rancher, not a helpless fool. But the accumulation of unwashed dishes, dusty corners, and mended then remended shirts had finally convinced him that pride was a poor substitute for practicality. So he'd sent Violet Sloan a return letter with travel funds and instructions. She'd replied with a telegram. Arriving April 12th. Stop. Grateful for opportunity. Stop V. Sloan. Today was April 12th. The stagecoach was 3 hours late. Thunder rumbled across the prairie, low and threatening. Cade's black gelding, Flint, shifted nervously in the corral, ears flattened against his skull. The ranch hands had already secured the outbuildings and brought the near pasture cattle closer to shelter. Cade had sent them to the bunkhouse an hour ago. Whatever was coming, weather or otherwise, he'd face it first. The stagecoach finally appeared through the curtain of dust and distance, rocking violently over the rutted road. The driver was pushing the team hard, trying to beat the storm. Cade straightened, his hand instinctively moving to adjust his hat, a gesture left over from a time when such things had mattered to him. The coach clattered into the yard with considerably less dignity than it had likely left Austin with that morning. Mud caked the wheels. One door hung slightly askew. The driver, a grizzled man named Tucker, whom Cade knew from previous supply runs, looked thoroughly done with the day. "Rockwell," Tucker called down, his voice rough as gravel. "Got your delivery. Though I'll tell you straight, this ain't what your wire specified." Cade's jaw tightened. "Explain." But Tucker was already climbing down, moving to open the passenger door with the weariness of a man who'd witnessed too much strangeness to be surprised by any of it. "Best you see for yourself." The door swung open. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a woman's hand appeared, gripping the door frame with white-knuckled intensity. The hand was small, fine-boned, but the grip suggested steel beneath the skin. Violet Sloane stepped down. She was younger than Cade had anticipated, perhaps 25, though her eyes held the kind of exhaustion that aged a person beyond years. Dark brown hair had been pinned severely back from a pale face marked by high cheekbones, and a mouth set in a grim line of determination. Her dress was serviceable gray wool, mud-splattered and travel-worn. She moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. But it was her eyes that stopped him, deep brown, almost black, and haunted by something Cade recognized because he'd seen it in his own mirror often enough, the look of someone who'd survived something they shouldn't have had to. She met his gaze directly, unflinching. "Mr. Rockwell, I'm Violet Sloane. I apologize for the delay. The storm." "Ain't the storm that's the problem," Tucker interrupted, then gestured back toward the coach. "It's the extras." Violet's composure cracked just for an instant. Her hand moved to her throat, then dropped. "They're with me." "Your letter made no mention," Cade began, but then the rest of his sentence died in his throat. Two children emerged from the stagecoach. The first was a girl of perhaps 7, all sharp angles and serious eyes beneath a tangle of brown curls that had escaped whatever pins had once contained them. She wore a dress that might have been blue once, but had faded to the color of old sky, and she descended the coach steps with the cautious deliberation of someone expecting the ground to disappear beneath her feet. The second child was smaller, 5, maybe 6, with the same dark eyes as the older girl, but a softer face, still holding on to the rounded sweetness of early childhood. Her blonde hair hung in 2 braids, and she clutched a cloth doll with one hand while the other gripped her sister's sleeve. Both girls immediately moved to Violet's sides, pressing against her skirts like small ships seeking harbor. The silence that followed was broken only by thunder and the restless stamping of the coach horses. Cade stared. He'd prepared for one woman, one housekeeper, one person to manage his household in exchange for fair wages and a roof that didn't leak. He had not prepared for this, for the sudden invasion of his carefully maintained solitude by a woman with secrets in her eyes and 2 little girls who looked at him like he might be just another person about to send them away. "Mr. Rockwell," Violet said quietly, and her voice held the steady calm of someone making a final stand. "I apologize for the lack of notice. If you'll allow me to explain—" "Inside," Cade heard himself say. His voice came out rougher than intended. "Storm's coming. Tucker, help me with the bags." "Ain't many," Tucker muttered, hauling down a single battered trunk and 2 small bundles. "Traveling light." Traveling fast, Cade thought. Running. He took the trunk, surprisingly heavy for its size, and gestured toward the house with a jerk of his head. "Go on then, before the rain hits." Violet hesitated, clearly uncertain whether this constituted acceptance or merely postponement of rejection. Then the first fat raindrops began to fall, and the decision was made for her. She gathered her skirts in one hand, placed her other hand on the older girl's shoulder, and moved toward the porch with the determined stride of someone who'd learned long ago that hesitation was a luxury she couldn't afford. The younger girl followed, her doll clutched tight. The older girl cast one long, measuring look at Cade, assessing him, filing away information, already calculating risks, before she too climbed the steps. By the time they reached the porch, the sky had opened completely. Rain hammered down in sheets, turning the yard to mud, and the distant prairie to a gray smudge of water and wind. Lightning split the darkness, followed immediately by thunder so loud the house timbers groaned. The younger girl whimpered and pressed closer to Violet. Cade shouldered open the front door and stood aside. In. The interior of the house was dim, cool, and exactly as he'd left it that morning. Functional, clean enough, but bearing the unmistakable mark of a man living alone. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting space all at once, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall and a heavy wooden table in the center. 2 doors led off to bedrooms. A third led to what had once been his mother's sewing room, but now held only dust and memories. Violet stepped inside, water dripping from her hem. The girls followed, their eyes huge as they took in their surroundings. Cade noticed the older one's gaze went immediately to the exits, the front door, the back door visible through the kitchen, the windows. Calculating escape routes. He knew that habit. He'd developed it himself long ago. Tucker deposited the trunk with a grunt, tipped his hat to Violet, a gesture of respect that spoke well of the woman, if Tucker considered her due courtesy, and ducked back out into the storm. "Good luck, Rockwell," he called over the rain. "You're gonna need it." Then the door closed, and Cade was alone with three strangers in a house that had been silent for so long he'd forgotten how small it became when filled with other people. Violet drew herself up straighter, which was impressive considering she couldn't have stood more than 5 feet 4 inches in her boots. "Mr. Rockwell, I owe you honesty. When I applied for this position, I was unaware that circumstances would require me to bring my—" She hesitated, the pause so brief Cade almost missed it. "My charges with me. If my presence is unacceptable under these conditions, I understand. But I would ask that you allow us to shelter here until the storm passes and the next stage arrives. I have funds enough for our return fare." She had a good voice, Cade noted distantly. Educated. Eastern, maybe, or at least schooled somewhere that cared about such things. It didn't match the desperation he'd sensed in her letters. "Their names," he said. Violet blinked. "I'm sorry?" "The girls. They have names, I assume." "Oh." Something flickered across her face. Relief, perhaps, that he hadn't immediately ordered them back into the storm. She placed a hand on the older girl's shoulder. "This is Poppy, and this—" Her hand moved to the younger child's head, a gesture so naturally protective it spoke of long habit, "is May." "Poppy and May," Cade repeated. The names hung in the air, making the children real in a way that simple observation hadn't. "They yours?" Another hesitation. "They're in my care." Which wasn't an answer, but Cade let it lie. He had plenty of his own questions he didn't care to answer. He moved past them to the fireplace, kneeling to build up the fire that had been banked low since morning. The kindling caught quickly, and soon flames were licking up around the larger logs, casting warm light across the room. The girls inched closer to the heat, though they kept Violet between themselves and Cade like a human shield. "You're soaked through," Cade said, still not looking at them. "There's a bedroom through that door. Used to be my mother's. Should be linens in the chest, quilts on the bed. Get yourselves dry. I'll see about supper." "Mr. Rockwell," Violet began. "We'll talk after you're dry and fed," Cade interrupted. "Go on." For a moment he thought she might argue. But then the younger girl, May, sneezed, a tiny wet sound that seemed to tip the balance. Violet nodded once, gathered the girls, and retreated to the bedroom. The door closed softly behind them. Cade remained by the fire, listening to the storm rage outside and the quiet murmur of voices from the other room. He could make out Violet's low tones, reassuring, and the higher, uncertain responses of the children. What the hell had he gotten himself into? He rose, moved to the kitchen, and began pulling out supplies for a simple meal. Beans, cornbread, salt pork. Not fancy, but hot and filling. As he worked, his mind turned over the problem with the methodical precision he applied to everything else in his life. Facts. Violet Sloan had traveled from San Antonio with 2 children she claimed were in her care. She'd been intentionally vague in her correspondence. She had funds enough to pay return fare, which suggested she wasn't destitute. But if that were true, why apply for a housekeeping position on a remote ranch in the middle of nowhere? She was running. The question was from what? The bedroom door opened. Violet emerged first, changed into a simple brown dress that was dry but no less worn than the first. She'd unpinned her hair and rebraided it into a long plait over one shoulder. Without the severe styling, she looked younger, softer, still wary, but less like a woman about to bolt. Poppy and May followed, also in dry clothes, faded cotton dresses that spoke of careful mending and meager circumstances. May still clutched her doll. Poppy's hand rested on her sister's shoulder in unconscious mimicry of Violet's earlier gesture. "Sit," Cade said, nodding toward the table. "Food's almost ready." They sat. The girls perched on the edge of their chairs like birds ready to take flight. Violet folded her hands in her lap with the composed stillness of someone who'd learned to wait. Cade served the meal in silence, ladling beans onto tin plates, adding chunks of cornbread still warm from the Dutch oven. He poured milk for the girls, fresh that morning from his neighbor's dairy cow, and coffee for himself and Violet. Black, strong, the way he preferred it. May stared at her plate as if unsure whether she was allowed to eat. Poppy looked to Violet, who nodded once. Only then did the children pick up their spoons. They ate with the focused intensity of people who'd known hunger. Not the comfortable, temporary hunger of missing a meal, but the deeper kind. The kind that taught you to never waste food, never take fullness for granted, never assume there would be more tomorrow. Cade knew that hunger too. When the edges had been taken off, when May's eyes were growing heavy and Poppy's rigid posture had softened slightly, Violet finally spoke. "You're owed an explanation, Snasin." "I'm owed honesty," Cade corrected. "You can keep your explanations if you like. But if you're staying, even temporarily, I need to know whether someone's going to come looking for these girls. Whether there's trouble following you." Violet's hands tightened around her coffee cup. For a long moment she said nothing, and Cade thought she might refuse to answer. Then she lifted her eyes to his, and the weight of what he saw there made something in his chest tighten unexpectedly. "No one is looking for them," she said quietly. "Not anymore. They have nowhere else to go. And neither do I." The words hung in the air, simple and devastating. "Their parents?" Cade asked. "Dead. Both of them. There's no other family willing to take them." May's eyes filled with tears, though she made no sound. Poppy put an arm around her sister and glared at Cade with sudden fierceness, as if daring him to say something that would hurt May further. "Then why the secrecy?" Cade pressed, keeping his voice level. "Why not mention them in your letter?" "Because every position I've applied for in the past 6 months has rejected me the moment they learned I came with children," Violet said. There was no self-pity in her voice, only tired pragmatism. "I thought perhaps if I could prove myself capable first, demonstrate that I could manage the work, that you might be willing to reconsider." "That's a hell of an assumption." "It was the only option I had left, Mr. Rockwell. I've exhausted every other avenue, every charity home, every aid society, every possible placement. No one wants 2 girls with no inheritance and no connections, and I will not—" Her voice sharpened with sudden steel. "I will not see them separated or sent to some workhouse where they'll be treated as nothing more than free labor." May had begun to cry silently, tears sliding down her round cheeks. Poppy's arm tightened around her sister, and she continued to stare at Cade with that unsettling mixture of fear and defiance. Cade set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "How old are you, Poppy?" The girl blinked, surprised to be addressed directly. "7, sir." "May's 5. "And you can read?" A cautious nod. "Yes, sir. Violet taught us." "Can you both work?" "Age-appropriate work," he clarified, seeing Violet stiffen. "Collecting eggs, feeding chickens, simple mending, not heavy labor." Poppy's chin lifted. "We can work. We're not useless." "Didn't say you were." Cade turned his attention back to Violet. "What happened to their parents?" "Fever. Last winter. It took their mother first, then their father 3 days later." Violet's voice remained steady, but her knuckles had gone white around her cup. "I was their mother's companion. When she fell ill, I cared for her. When she died, I promised I would look after the girls. Their father, he wasn't well, even before the fever. When he died too, there was nothing left, no money, no property. The landlord sold what little they had to cover back rent. We've been living on the small savings I'd managed to set aside and what I could earn taking in mending." 6 months, Cade said slowly. "You've been caring for them for 6 months on nothing but savings and mending work." "Yes. And you're, what, 25? 26? 24. 24 years old, and she'd taken on the full responsibility of 2 orphan children with no legal obligation, no support, and no resources. Either Violet Sloane was a saint or a fool. Cade strongly suspected she was neither. Outside, the storm was beginning to ease, the thunder growing distant. Rain still fell, but softer now, a steady drumbeat rather than a deluge. The fire crackled. May's tears had slowed, and she'd begun to nod against her sister's shoulder. Cade stood, and all 3 of them tensed immediately. He ignored the reaction and moved to the window, staring out at the rain-soaked darkness of his land. 2,000 acres of tough prairie grass, rocky soil, and stubborn cattle. He'd built this ranch from nothing after returning from a war that had tried to break him. He'd chosen isolation deliberately, crafted a life where he answered to no one and relied on nothing but his own strength and will. These three strangers in his house represented everything he'd worked to avoid. Complication, dependence, the messy, unpredictable chaos of other people's needs and histories. He should send them away, make sure they had fun, see them safely to the next stage, and return to the quiet order of his carefully constructed solitude. But when he turned back, he found himself looking at May, small, exhausted May, with her cloth doll and her silent tears, and something in his chest cracked just enough to let in a sliver of light he'd thought he'd sealed away years ago. 2 weeks, he heard himself say. You work, you prove you can manage this house, and not interfere with the ranch operation, and we'll see about making it permanent, but he held up a hand as relief flooded Violet's face. There are conditions. Anything, Violet said immediately. The girls stay out of the ranch hand's way. They don't wander past the creek to the south or into the north pastures. They listen when I tell them something, and they listen when you tell them something. This is a working ranch, not a playground. It's dangerous for anyone who doesn't know what they're doing. Understood. And you, Cade continued, fixing Violet with a hard look, you tell me if someone comes looking. I don't care what it is or who they are. If there's trouble, I need to know about it before it arrives on my doorstep. There won't be trouble, Violet said, but something in her eyes suggested she wasn't entirely certain of that. 2 weeks, Cade repeated. After that, we'll talk terms if things work out. If they don't, I'll pay your way to Austin and give you references for other positions. Fair? More than fair. Violet's voice was thick with emotion she was clearly struggling to contain. Thank you, Mr. Rockwell. I promise you won't regret this. Cade sincerely doubted that, but what he said was, get them to bed. Morning comes early on a ranch, and tomorrow you'll start learning your duties. Violet nodded and rose, gently waking May and guiding both girls toward the bedroom. At the threshold, Poppy turned back. Mr. Rockwell? Her voice was small but clear. Will you really let us stay? For real? Cade met those serious 7-year-old eyes and saw in them a wariness that no child should have to carry. For now, he said, get some sleep. Poppy nodded slowly, processing this, filing it away with whatever other information she'd gathered about him. Then she slipped through the door, and it closed behind them. Cade was alone again in his house, but the silence felt different now. Occupied. Changed. He returned to the window, watching the last of the storm clouds break apart to reveal a slice of stars. The rain had softened to a drizzle. By morning, the sun would return, and with it, the hard work of running a ranch that had no patience for distraction or sentiment. He'd given them 2 weeks. That seemed reasonable, long enough for Violet to prove herself capable or reveal whatever trouble she was running from, long enough for the girls to either adapt or demonstrate they were too much disruption for a working ranch. 2 weeks, and then he could return to the quiet, ordered life he'd built. But as Cade banked the fire and prepared for bed, he couldn't shake the image of May's tears, or Poppy's protective fierceness, or Violet's exhausted determination. He couldn't forget the feeling of his house breathing again after years of holding its breath. And somewhere in the deepest part of himself, the part he'd tried to bury along with everything else he'd lost, Cade Rockwell recognized the uncomfortable truth. His carefully constructed isolation had just taken its first real hit. The next 2 weeks were going to be considerably more complicated than he'd anticipated. Morning came with the relentless brightness peculiar to Texas after a storm. Cade woke before dawn, as always, to the sound of roosters and the restless lowing of cattle in the near pasture. He dressed quickly in the dark, work shirt, worn denims, boots that had seen 10 years of hard use, and emerged from his bedroom to find the main room empty and the house still silent. Good. He needed coffee and solitude before facing whatever this day was going to bring. But when he reached the kitchen, he found Violet already there. She stood at the stove with her back to him, still in her nightgown and wrapper, her long braid hanging down her back. She'd built up the fire and had coffee brewing. He could smell it, dark and strong. Her movements were efficient, practiced, those of someone who'd run a household before. "You're up early," Cade said. Violet jumped, spinning around with one hand pressed to her chest. "Mr. Rockwell, I didn't hear you. I'm sorry. I should have asked before using your kitchen." "It's fine." He moved past her to pour himself coffee, noting the slight tremor in her hands as she stepped aside, still skittish, still ready to apologize for existing. "If you're making breakfast, there's eggs in the cold box and bacon in the larder." "I found them, thank you." She hesitated, then added quietly, "The girls are still sleeping. They were exhausted." "Let them rest then. Plenty of time to establish routines." Cade took his coffee to the table and sat, watching her work. She moved well in a kitchen, he'd give her that. No wasted motion, no fumbling with unfamiliar tools. She found the cast iron skillet, the spatula, the plates, all without having to search. "You've done this before," he observed. "Run a household." "I grew up in one that valued such skills." Violet cracked eggs into the pan with practiced ease. "And I worked as a companion for several years. Household management was part of my duties." "Where?" "San Antonio, most recently. Before that, Houston." "You're from Texas, then?" A slight pause. "No, I came here 5 years ago." "From?" "Virginia." The word came out clipped, final, a door closing on further questions. Cade let it drop. He'd get the full story eventually, or he wouldn't. Either way, pushing now would only make her more defensive. They ate breakfast in companionable silence, broken only by the sizzle of bacon and the scrape of forks on tin plates. Violet had set aside portions for the girls, covering them with a cloth to keep them warm. She ate quickly, efficiently, like someone accustomed to taking meals standing or on the run. "I'll need to show you the house properly," Cade said when they'd finished. "Where things are kept, what needs doing. The garden's been neglected, hasn't been tended since Mrs. Garrett left. If you've got any skill with growing things, that'd be useful come summer." "I can manage a garden." "Washing's done on Mondays and Thursdays. There's a line out back and a good wash tub in the shed. Water comes from the well. It's clean, cold, and reliable. Don't ever let it get low without telling me." Violet nodded, committing this to memory. "The hands eat in the bunkhouse mostly, but sometimes they'll come up for Sunday dinner if we're doing something special. There's 5 of them: Jed, Marcus, Tom, Billy, and Sam. They're good men, work hard, no trouble. They know to keep respectful around women." "And the ranch work?" "What should I know about your schedule? I'm up before dawn, out until midday unless there's trouble. Back for dinner at 1, then out again until dark. Cattle need checking, fences need mending, horses need training. Spring's calving season, so I'll be spending more time in the far pastures." He paused. "I'll need packed meals some days." "Can you manage that?" "Of course." "Then we'll start there." Cade rose, carrying his plate to the wash basin. "Get the girls fed and dressed. I'll show you around the property after morning chores. But there's one thing you should understand right now." Violet turned to face him, her expression guarded. "This ranch runs on a schedule," Cade said quietly. "Cattle don't care about convenience or comfort. Weather doesn't ask permission. Things break, animals get sick, problems arise without warning. I need to know you can handle that you won't fall apart if something goes wrong or if I'm not here to solve every little crisis." "I won't fall apart, Mr. Rockwell." "See that you don't." He moved toward the door, then stopped. "And Violet, call me Cade. Mr. Rockwell was my father, and I'd rather not be reminded of him." He left before she could respond, stepping out into a morning scrubbed clean by yesterday's storm. The air smelled of wet earth and new grass. Puddles reflected the brightening sky. In the distance, his hands were already moving among the cattle, checking for storm damage or injury. This was his world, solid, predictable, manageable. And for the next 2 weeks, he'd do his damnedest to keep it that way, 3 unexpected guests notwithstanding. Behind him, through the open window, he heard the bedroom door open and the soft, wondering voice of May. "Violet, is this really our home now?" And Violet's response, gentle but honest. "For a little while, sweetheart. For a little while." Cade walked toward the barn, the weight of those words settling uncomfortably in his chest. A little while. 2 weeks. That was all this was. He needed to remember that. 2 weeks turned out to be an entirely inadequate time frame for anything, Cade discovered. Not long enough to establish true routines, but just long enough to start depending on them. The first 3 days passed in a flurry of adjustment. Violet attacked the house with the determination of a woman proving her worth, scrubbing floors that didn't strictly need scrubbing, reorganizing cupboards, mending curtains that had hung crooked for so long Kate had stopped noticing. She moved through the rooms like a quiet storm, leaving order in her wake. The girls proved more challenging to categorize. May shadowed Violet constantly those first days, rarely speaking above a whisper, her cloth doll always clutched in one small fist. But Poppy was different. She observed everything with those sharp, calculating eyes, testing boundaries with the strategic precision of a scout mapping enemy territory. On the fourth morning, Cade found her in the barn. He'd come in to check on a mare who'd seemed off her feed the previous evening and discovered Poppy standing outside the stall, perfectly still, watching the horse with focused intensity. She wore one of her faded dresses and boots that were slightly too large, likely handed down or borrowed. Her hair had been braided by Violet into two neat plaits, but already wisps were escaping around her face. "She's favoring her left foreleg," Poppy said without turning around, "and she keeps looking at her flank. Might be colic." Cade stopped short. "How do you know that?" "My papa had horses, before." The last word carried the weight of everything that had come after. "He taught me to watch for signs." Cade moved to the stall, running his hand along the mare's neck. She was warm, restless, and yes, definitely favoring that leg. "Your papa taught you well. He said horses can't tell you when something hurts, so you have to learn their language." Poppy finally turned to look at him. "Will she be all right?" "If it's colic, we caught it early. I'll walk her, keep her moving, watch for the next few hours." He paused, considering. "You can help, if Violet doesn't need you." Something shifted in Poppy's expression, not quite a smile, but a softening of that perpetual wariness. "I'd like that." So Cade found himself walking circles in the paddock with a 7-year-old girl and a colicky mare, explaining the signs to watch for, the treatments that worked, the delicate balance of knowing when to call the veterinarian from town and when to trust your own judgment. Poppy absorbed it all with the intensity of someone starving for knowledge, asking questions that showed she actually understood what he was telling her. "Why'd you choose ranching?" she asked after they'd been walking for an hour. The mare was looking better, less agitated, more willing to graze. "Seemed like honest work," Cade said, "and I like the quiet." "Do you still like it?" "The quiet, I mean, now that we're here." It was a surprisingly perceptive question from someone so young. Cade glanced down at her. "Jury's still out." Poppy nodded solemnly as if this was exactly the answer she'd expected. "Violet says we have to be very good, that we can't mess this up because there's nowhere else to go." "Your sister know you're worried about that?" "May doesn't worry about things the same way I do. She just gets sad." Poppy's hand moved to the mare's neck, stroking the smooth coat with surprising gentleness. "I have to worry enough for both of us." "That's a heavy load for someone your size." "Someone's got to carry it." She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, and Cade recognized that tone too. The voice of someone who'd learned too young that survival required sacrifice. They walked in silence for a while longer. The sun climbed higher, warming the cool morning air. From the house, Cade could hear the faint sounds of Violet working, the rhythmic thump of rugs being beaten, the splash of water from the pump. May's higher voice called something he couldn't make out, and Violet's response came low and reassuring. "Mr. Rockwell?" Poppy said quietly. "Cade, Violet said we should call you Cade." "That's right. Are you going to send us away? After the 2 weeks?" Cade stopped walking. The mare, sensing the change, stopped too and lowered her head to crop at the grass. The question hung in the air between them, and Cade understood that whatever he said next would matter, would be remembered and measured against all future actions. "I haven't decided yet," he said honestly, "but I'll tell you this. If you do have to leave, it won't be because you weren't good enough or didn't work hard enough. It'll be because this ranch isn't the right place for you. Sometimes things don't work out, and it's nobody's fault." Poppy studied him for a long moment, weighing his words against some internal measure. Then she nodded once, accepting this, and resumed walking. "That's fair, I guess." Fair. Such a simple word for such a complicated concept. But Cade supposed that for a child who'd lost everything, fairness was probably the most she dared hope for. By the time they returned the mare to her stall, recovered, calm, no longer showing signs of distress. The morning had burned away into afternoon. Cade's stomach was reminding him loudly that he'd missed his usual midday meal, and Poppy had begun to drag her feet with exhaustion. They found Violet on the back porch, hanging laundry on the line strung between two posts. Sheets billowed in the breeze like white sails. May sat nearby on the steps, carefully sorting clothespins by size, a task that clearly had more to do with keeping her occupied than any practical purpose. "There you are," Violet said, relief evident in her voice. "I was beginning to worry." "Mare had colic," Kate explained. "Poppy helped walk her through it." Violet's eyebrows rose. "Did she?" "She knows horses. Her father taught her." Something flickered across Violet's face. Grief, perhaps, or memory. "Yes, he did." She smoothed her hands down her apron, a nervous gesture. "I've kept your dinner warm. And Poppy, you need to wash up before you eat. You're covered in horse." Poppy looked down at herself, seeming to notice for the first time the dust and hay clinging to her dress. "Oh." "Go on," Violet said gently. "May will help you. Won't you, sweetheart?" May nodded and scrambled to her feet, taking her sister's hand. The two of them disappeared into the house, leaving Cade and Violet alone among the flapping sheets. "Thank you," Violet said quietly, "for letting her help. She needs to feel useful." "She was useful," Cade said. "Girl's got a good eye. Spotted the problem before I did." "Her father would have been proud." Violet reached for another wet sheet, shaking it out with practiced efficiency. "He was a good man, gentle, kind. The fever took him so quickly." Her voice caught, and she stopped, pressing her lips together hard. Cade should have gone inside. Should have left her to her grief and her laundry and the privacy of her thoughts. But something kept him rooted there, watching the way the sunlight caught in her dark braid, the way her hands moved with such careful control, as if she was afraid that stopping would mean falling apart entirely. "How long were you with their family?" he asked. 3 years. I was hired as a companion to their mother. She had a weak constitution, needed someone to manage the household, help with the girls. Their father was often away on business. Violet clipped the sheet to the line with more force than necessary. "When she fell ill, I did everything I could. It wasn't enough." "Fever's not something you can fight with determination." "I know that. Rationally, I know that. But she made me promise. At the end, when she knew she wasn't going to survive, she made me promise I'd look after them. Both of them. And then their father died, and suddenly I was all they had. And I had no legal right to them. No money. No plan." She broke off, jaw clenched. "I'm sorry. You don't need to hear this." "Didn't say I didn't want to." Violet looked at him then, really looked at him, and Cade saw her reassessing him in real time, adjusting whatever assumptions she'd made based on his rough exterior and solitary life. "Why did you let us stay?" she asked. "The truth, Cade. You could have sent us away that first night." "Maybe I'm curious to see if you'll actually make it 2 weeks," he said, deflecting. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got right now." He moved toward the door, then paused. "The mare's name is Dancer. If Poppy wants to check on her later, that'd be fine. Girl should know her patient recovered." He left Violet standing among the sheets, her expression unreadable, and went inside to the dinner she'd kept warm. The house smelled of bread and stewed meat, and something he couldn't quite name, something that felt dangerously close to home. The days developed a rhythm after that. Cade woke before dawn and found Violet already in the kitchen, coffee brewing, breakfast in progress. The girls would emerge sleepy-eyed and quiet, eating quickly before beginning whatever tasks Violet had assigned them. Poppy took to following Cade around the ranch when her chores were finished, absorbing everything he told her about cattle, horses, land management, weather signs. May stayed closer to home, helping Violet in the garden that was slowly coming back to life under determined care. By the end of the first week, Cade had stopped thinking of the house as empty when he returned at midday, had stopped being surprised by the sound of May's laughter, or Poppy's questions, or Violet's quiet humming as she worked. The hands noticed too. Jed commented that the ranch felt livelier, and even Gruff Sam admitted it was nice to smell fresh bread when the wind blew right. On Sunday, Violet prepared a dinner that brought all 5 ranch hands up to the house with their hats in their hands and genuine gratitude in their eyes. She'd made pot roast with vegetables from the newly revived garden, fresh rolls, and a dried apple pie that made Billy declare he'd died and gone to heaven. The men were respectful, careful not to curse, patient when May shyly offered them more coffee with trembling hands. Cade watched from the head of the table, saying little, but noting everything. The way Violet moved through the room with quiet confidence, ensuring everyone had enough. The way Poppy sat up straighter when the hands complimented her help with the vegetables. The way May's smile grew wider each time someone thanked her. The way his house had stopped feeling like a place he simply existed and started feeling like something else entirely. After the hands returned to the bunkhouse, full and content, Cade helped Violet with the dishes, an offer that clearly surprised her. They worked in companionable silence, her washing, him drying, the girls playing quietly in the corner with a set of carved wooden animals that had been his as a boy. "We're past halfway through your trial," Violet said suddenly. "I suppose you'll be making your decision soon." Cade set down the plate he'd been drying. "And if I asked you to stay, permanently?" Violet's hand stilled in the wash water. "Are you asking?" "Considering it." "Why?" She turned to face him, soapy water dripping from her hands. "You've made it clear you value your solitude. We're the opposite of that. We're noise and complication and disruption. Why would you willingly choose that?" It was a fair question. Cade wasn't entirely sure he had a good answer. "Place needs a housekeeper," he said finally. "You're good at the work. The girls aren't as much trouble as I expected. Seems practical." "Practical." Violet's mouth twisted slightly. "That's your reason? You want a different one?" "I want the truth, Cade. Because if we stay, if we make this permanent, I need to know we're not just a convenience that you'll regret when the newness wears off and you remember how much you prefer being alone." Cade leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. The truth. What was the truth? That he found himself listening for May's laughter during the day? That Poppy's questions made him think about the ranch in new ways? That Violet's presence had somehow made the silence less peaceful and more just? Lonely? "This place has been dead quiet for years," he said slowly. "Since before the war, really. After I came back, I thought that's what I wanted. No noise, no demands, no one needing anything from me. And it worked, for a while. But lately—" He stopped, frustrated by his inability to articulate what he was feeling. "This house was built for a family. My parents raised 4 kids here. After they died, after my brothers and sister moved on, it's just been me. And I didn't realize how much that mattered until you 3 showed up and reminded me what it used to sound like." Violet stared at him, her eyes wide and dark in the lamplight. "That's the most I've heard you say at one time since we arrived. Don't get used to it." A small smile tugged at her mouth. "If we stay, and I'm not saying we will, not until you actually make a formal offer, but if we do, I need you to understand something. Those girls have lost everyone. They've been passed over, rejected, told their burdens. If we stay, they're going to start hoping, start believing this is real. And if you change your mind later, if you decide you were wrong and this was a mistake, it will break them in ways I'm not sure they can recover from." "I don't make offers I don't intend to keep," Cade said quietly. "If I ask you to stay, it's because I mean it." "Then ask me properly, not considering it or seems practical. Ask me like you mean it." Cade held her gaze, seeing the challenge there, the fierce protectiveness, the desperation she was trying so hard to hide. This woman who'd given up everything for 2 children who weren't even hers by blood, who'd traveled across Texas with nothing but determination and hope, who stood in his kitchen with soapy hands demanding that he be clear about his intentions. She deserved honesty. "Stay," he said. "All 3 of you, not as a trial, as permanent residents of this ranch. I'll pay fair wages, provide room and board, and make sure those girls have what they need. In return, you manage the house and let me teach Poppy about horses if she's interested. And when May's old enough, maybe she can help in the garden or with the chickens or whatever suits her. This doesn't have to be complicated, Violet. It can just be an arrangement that works for everyone." "An arrangement," Violet repeated softly. "What else would you call it?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned back to the dishes, her shoulders tense. I suppose I'd call it a second chance. For all of us. From the corner, May's voice piped up. Violet, can we stay? Please, can we stay? Neither adult had realized the girls were listening. Poppy stood now too, her expression carefully neutral, but her hands clenched tight at her sides. May clutched her doll, eyes huge with hope and fear in equal measure. Violet looked at Cade one more time, searching his face for something. Certainty, perhaps, or trustworthiness, or simple sincerity. Whatever she saw must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. Yes, she said to the girls. We can stay. May's shriek of joy was loud enough to startle the chickens in their coop. She launched herself at Violet, wrapping small arms around her waist. Poppy moved more slowly, but her tight control had cracked enough to let genuine relief show through. Really? Poppy asked, looking at Cade. You really mean it? This is our home now? It's your home, Cade confirmed. Long as you want it to be. Poppy nodded, processing this, then did something unexpected. She crossed to Cade and stuck out her hand like she'd seen adults do. Thank you, sir. We won't let you down. Cade shook her small hand gravely. I know. That night, after the girls had been put to bed and Violet had retired to her own room, Cade sat alone on the porch, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Cattle lowing in the distance, wind through the grass, an owl hunting somewhere beyond the barn. He just permanently altered the course of his carefully controlled life, taken on responsibility for 3 people who were basically strangers, committed himself to noise and complication and all the messy unpredictability he'd worked so hard to avoid. And somehow, it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like the house had just started breathing properly again after years of holding its breath. The second week brought new rhythms and small revelations. Poppy proved herself invaluable around the horses, having inherited not just her father's knowledge, but his gentle way with nervous animals. May discovered a talent for finding eggs in places the chickens had hidden them, turning the daily collection into a game that made her giggle. Violet transformed the house room by room, not just cleaning but restoring it, hanging curtains she'd mended and starched, arranging wildflowers in jars, making the space feel lived in rather than merely occupied. But it was the small, unguarded moments that caught Cade off guard. May slipping and calling him Papa before catching herself and dissolving into embarrassed tears. Poppy asking his opinion on whether they should plant more beans or squash in the garden, as if his answer mattered to her sense of what their future would hold. Violet humming an old song while she worked, the sound floating through open windows and settling into corners of the house that had been silent too long. On the 13th day, Cade came back from checking fence lines earlier than expected and heard voices from the kitchen. He paused just outside, not meaning to eavesdrop but unable to help overhearing. Do you think he'll marry you? That was Poppy, blunt as always. What? No, Poppy, where did that idea come from? Violet sounded flustered. Jed said ranchers usually marry their housekeepers eventually. That it makes sense because they're already living together and working together. Jed should mind his own business, Violet said firmly. Mr. Rockwell, Cade, has been kind enough to offer us a home and employment. That's all this is. An employment arrangement. But don't you like him? May's voice this time, smaller, more tentative. A long pause. That's not relevant, sweetheart. But you do, Poppy pressed. I can tell. You get all quiet when he comes in, and you made that special pie just because Billy mentioned it was his favorite. I made that pie because it's good manners to acknowledge your employer's preferences, Violet said, but her voice had gone tight. Now, both of you, enough of this speculation. Cade has given us a place when no one else would. The least we can do is respect his privacy and not make assumptions about his feelings or intentions. Cade retreated before he could hear more, his boots crunching deliberately loud on the gravel to announce his approach. By the time he entered the kitchen, all 3 were focused intently on their tasks. Violet kneading bread dough, the girls snapping green beans, though Poppy's ears had gone pink. Fences are good, Cade said, as if he'd heard nothing. But there's a spot by the creek that needs reinforcement. I'll take care of it tomorrow. Will you need a packed lunch? Violet asked, not meeting his eyes. Probably. It's a good hour's ride. I'll prepare it tonight. The conversation was painfully normal. almost aggressively so. May kept sneaking glances between the two adults, clearly trying to assess whether they'd somehow revealed the conversation Cade had absolutely not overheard. Poppy focused on her beans with unusual intensity. Later, after dinner, Cade found himself alone with Violet on the porch. She'd come out to shake the rugs, and he'd followed with his coffee, drawn by something he couldn't quite name. The evening was cooling down, the heat of the day giving way to that particular softness of spring twilight. "The girls settled?" he asked. "Reading. Poppy's teaching May from the primer I found in the trunk." Violet paused in her work, leaning against the porch rail. "They're good girls, Cade. I know they have their moments, May's nightmares, Poppy's stubbornness, but they're trying so hard." "I know. And I'm grateful. I want you to know that. This, what you've given us, it's more than I had any right to hope for." Cade sipped his coffee, choosing his words carefully. "You ever think about the future? What happens when they're grown?" Violet's hands tightened on the railing. "Every day. I think about making sure they have educations, opportunities, choices I never had. I think about May maybe teaching. She loves books, loves learning. And Poppy." She smiled slightly. "Poppy could run this ranch better than either of us by the time she's 16 if someone let her." "Someone meaning me?" "Someone meaning whoever owns it. I'm not assuming—" She stopped herself. "I'm just saying she has the mind for it, the instincts." "And you?" Cade asked quietly. "What about what you want?" Violet turned to look at him then, and in the fading light her eyes were very dark. "I want them safe. I want them happy. I want them to grow up knowing they're wanted, that they matter, that they have a place in this world." She paused. "I don't ask for more than that." "Maybe you should." The words hung between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to examine. Violet's breath caught, just slightly, and Cade saw the exact moment she decided to retreat behind propriety and practicality. "It's getting late," she said, straightening. "I should check on the girls. Thank you for—" She gestured vaguely at the porch, the ranch, everything. "Thank you." She disappeared inside before he could respond, leaving Cade alone with his coffee and the uncomfortable realization that his tidy employment arrangement was becoming considerably less tidy with each passing day. On the 14th morning, Cade woke to shouting. He was out of bed and halfway to the main room before his brain fully caught up with his instincts, heart pounding, muscles tensed for whatever threat had invaded his home. But when he threw open his bedroom door, what he found wasn't an intruder or an accident or any of the disasters his mind had conjured. It was a woman. Tall, imposing, dressed in black silk that must have cost more than most families earned in a month, standing in his kitchen like she owned it. She held a piece of paper in one gloved hand and regarded Violet with the cold assessment of someone evaluating livestock. "You cannot seriously expect me to believe you're providing adequate care," the woman was saying, her voice sharp with cultivated disdain. "Living in this primitive situation, no proper schooling, no suitable society—" "They have everything they need," Violet said, her voice shaking but firm. The girls were behind her, both in their nightgowns, both pressed against her like they were trying to disappear. "They need family, Miss Sloane. Real family. Not some—" The woman's lip curled. "Some hired companion playing at motherhood." "Who the hell are you?" Cade's voice cut through the room like a blade. The woman's attention snapped to him, and her expression shifted from disdain to calculation in an instant. "Mr. Rockwell, I presume. I am Helena Whitmore, maternal aunt to these children, and I've come to take them home where they belong." Everything in the room went very, very still. "They are home," Violet said, barely above a whisper. Helena Whitmore's smile was thin and cold. "We'll see what the court has to say about that, won't we? I have a lawyer, Miss Sloane, and evidence that you've been harboring these children without proper legal authority. Did you think I wouldn't find you eventually?" She produced another paper from her reticule, unfolding it with deliberate slowness. "This is an affidavit, signed by 3 witnesses, testifying to your unstable situation. Moving from place to place, no permanent address, no means of support until quite recently. And there's the matter of your deception, telling everyone these children were yours when in fact—" Her eyes gleamed with triumph. "They're not your daughters at all, are they, Miss Sloane? They're your half-sisters. Born to your father and his second wife after your mother's death. Half-sisters you appropriated after their parents' death, with no legal right whatsoever. The room spun. Cade's gaze snapped to Violet, who had gone white as death. That's not, Violet started, but her voice failed. It's all documented, Helena continued smoothly. Their parents' marriage certificate, birth records, your father's will, which made no provision for you, the illegitimate daughter he barely acknowledged. Tell me, Miss Sloane, what exactly gives you the right to determine these children's future when you're nothing but a bastard your father refused to claim? The word hit like a physical blow. May began to cry, silent tears streaming down her face. Poppy's jaw was clenched so tight, Cade thought her teeth might crack. Get out, Cade said, his voice deadly quiet. Get out of my house. Now. Helena turned her cold smile on him. This doesn't concern you, Mr. Rockwell. These children are blood relations, and I intend to see them properly placed. With me in a respectable household, not in this— She waved a hand dismissively at the house. This rough frontier situation with a woman of questionable morality and a man who thought he could buy himself a convenient family. I said get out. I'll be back, Mr. Rockwell, with the sheriff and proper documentation, and when I do return, those children will be leaving with me. Helena folded her papers with crisp efficiency and moved toward the door. She paused at the threshold, looking back at Violet with something that might have been pity if it weren't so thoroughly coated in contempt. You should have known better than to think you could keep them. Girls like you never get to keep anything. Then she was gone, her carriage rattling away down the drive, leaving destruction in her wake. The silence after her departure was absolute. May's tears had become sobs, muffled against Violet's nightgown. Poppy stood rigid, her face blank with shock. And Violet looked like every foundation she'd built her life on had just been revealed as sand. Violet, Cade began. Don't. She held up a shaking hand. Please, just don't. She gathered the girls and retreated to the bedroom, the door closing with a soft click that somehow felt louder than a slam. Cade stood alone in his kitchen, staring at the space where Helena Whitmore had stood, and felt the ground shifting beneath everything he'd thought he understood. Half-sisters. Legal challenges. A past Violet had never mentioned, and secrets that were apparently about to tear his household apart, just when it had started to feel like something worth keeping. He poured himself cold coffee from yesterday's pot and walked out onto the porch, needing air, needing space to think. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the horizon in shades of rose and gold. His cattle were stirring in the near pasture. The ranch was waking up to another day of work that needed doing, regardless of whatever personal catastrophes were unfolding in the main house. But Cade couldn't focus on any of it. All he could see was the look on Violet's face when Helena Whitmore had called her a bastard. The way Poppy had gone still as stone. The sound of May's terrified sobs. And underneath it all, a growing anger, not at Violet for her deception, but at a world that would let a woman like Helena Whitmore walk into someone's home and threaten to destroy it with nothing more than legal papers and cruel words. Behind him, he heard the bedroom door open. Footsteps. Then Violet's voice, raw and broken. I should pack. We'll be gone by afternoon. I'm sorry, Cade. I'm so sorry. He turned to find her standing in the doorway, still in her nightgown and wrapper, her face blotchy with tears she'd tried to hide. The sight of her, this strong, determined woman who'd traveled across Texas on nothing but hope, now defeated by words and papers, ignited something fierce in Cade's chest. No, he said. Violet blinked. What? I said no. You're not packing, you're not leaving, and you're sure as hell not giving up without a fight. He set down his coffee cup and walked toward her. That woman came into my house, threatened my— He caught himself. Threatened people under my protection. That doesn't stand. Not on my land. You don't understand, Violet whispered. She's right. I have no legal claim to them. Their parents never formally adopted me as family. I'm just their father's bastard daughter from before he married their mother. I have no rights here. Then we'll get you rights. How? Cade, she has lawyers, she has money, she has standing in society. I have nothing. You have me, Cade said quietly, and maybe that's enough. Violet stared at him, and something flickered in her eyes. Hope, desperately fragile, trying to take root in scorched earth. Why would you do this? Why would you fight for us? Because in 2 weeks, you three have made this house feel more like home than it has in 10 years, Cade thought. Because Poppy's questions make me remember why I love this land in the first place. Because May's laughter sounds like music I forgot I missed. Because you've worked harder than anyone I've ever known and asked for nothing in return except a chance. Because somewhere along the way, this stopped being about practicality and started being about something else entirely. But what he said was, because it's right. Because those girls deserve better than being used as pawns in whatever game that woman is playing. And because I'm not in the habit of letting bullies win. He reached out and did something he'd never done before, touched her face, his rough, calloused hand cradling her cheek with surprising gentleness. We'll figure this out, Violet, together. But you have to trust me. A tear slid down her cheek, dampening his palm. I do, she whispered. God help me, I do. From the bedroom, Poppy's voice called out, small and scared. Violet, are we really leaving? Violet closed her eyes briefly, then called back, her voice steadier than it had any right to be. No, sweetheart, we're staying. We're going to fight. And in that moment, standing in the doorway of his rough frontier house with dawn breaking over the Texas prairie, Cade Rockwell understood that he'd just committed himself to a battle that might cost him everything. But as Violet's hand came up to cover his, her fingers cold and trembling, he found he didn't care about the cost. Some things were worth fighting for, even if you hadn't realized it until they were threatened. The morning stretched into afternoon with the weight of unspoken dread hanging over everything. Violet went through the motions of her daily tasks with mechanical precision, breakfast prepared but barely touched, dishes washed in silence, laundry hung with trembling hands. The girls stayed close, May refusing to let Violet out of her sight, Poppy watching the road with the vigilance of a sentry expecting attack. Kate had left shortly after their conversation on the porch, muttering something about town and business that needed handling. He'd returned 3 hours later with Sheriff Tom Bridger, a weathered man in his 50s whose steady eyes and calm demeanor suggested he'd seen enough trouble to know the difference between real threats and empty ones. Now they sat around the kitchen table, Cade, Violet, and the sheriff, while the girls played quietly in the corner, their ears undoubtedly tuned to every word despite their apparent focus on the wooden animals. Mrs. Whitmore came to see me this morning, Sheriff Bridger said, his voice gravelly but not unkind. Had quite a story about stolen children and fraudulent guardianship. Wanted me to remove those girls immediately. He paused, taking a sip of the coffee Violet had poured with shaking hands. I told her I'd need to investigate the situation before taking any action. Due diligence, I said. And? Cade's jaw was tight, his shoulders rigid with barely contained tension. And I'm here to hear your side, Miss Sloane, because Helena Whitmore strikes me as a woman more interested in winning than in what's actually right. The sheriff's gaze settled on Violet with surprising gentleness. Why don't you start from the beginning? Truth, now. All of it. Violet's hands twisted in her lap, her knuckles white. For a long moment, Cade thought she might refuse, might retreat behind that carefully constructed wall of privacy she'd maintained since arriving. But then she drew a deep breath and began to speak. My mother was a seamstress in Richmond, she said quietly. She died when I was 12. Before she passed, she told me my father was a gentleman named Thomas Hartwell, that he'd promised to marry her but married someone else instead when his family arranged a better match. She never asked him for anything, never told him she was carrying his child. She raised me alone. Her voice remained steady, but her eyes had gone distant, focused on something only she could see. After she died, I had no one. I ended up in a charity home until I was 16, then worked as a maid, a seamstress's assistant, whatever I could find. I never contacted Thomas Hartwell. I wanted nothing from him. But he found you, Sheriff Bridger said. It wasn't a question. His wife died when I was 20. He hired investigators to locate me. I never knew why. Guilt, perhaps, or loneliness. He asked me to come to San Antonio, offered me employment as a companion to his new wife. I didn't know he'd remarried until I arrived. Violet's mouth twisted slightly. Margaret Hartwell was young, frail, and kind. She was also pregnant with Poppy. So you became part of their household, the sheriff prompted. As an employee, nothing more. Thomas never acknowledged our relationship publicly. I was introduced as a distant cousin who'd fallen on hard times. But Margaret knew the truth, and she didn't care. She said I was family, whether Thomas admitted it or not. Violet's voice softened with memory. When Poppy was born, she asked me to be her godmother. When May came 2 years later, the same. And when she grew sicker, her constitution never fully recovered after May's birth, she relied on me more and more. The aunt, Mrs. Whitmore, where was she during all this? Kate asked. In Boston. She and Margaret weren't close. They'd been raised separately after their parents divorced. Different worlds, different values. Helena visited once, shortly after May was born, and made it clear she disapproved of everything. Thomas's business ventures, the modest household, Margaret's unsuitable health, even the children themselves. She said Poppy was too willful and May too delicate, that they'd never make proper society matches. Violet's hands clenched. Margaret asked her to leave. They hadn't spoken since. Sheriff Bridger set down his coffee cup with a thoughtful expression. So, when the fever came, Margaret died first. She made me promise to look after the girls, to make sure they stayed together. Thomas was devastated. He'd truly loved her, I think, in his way. He caught the fever 3 days later while sitting vigil at her grave. Before he died, he was delirious, barely coherent, but he called for me, held my hand, and whispered, "They're yours now." Violet's voice cracked. I don't know if he meant it legally or if it was just fever talk, but I kept my promise to Margaret. Did he leave a will? The sheriff asked. If he did, I never saw it. The landlord came within a week, demanding back rent. Thomas's business had failed months before. He'd kept it from Margaret to avoid worrying her. There was no money, no property, nothing. The landlord sold the furniture to cover what was owed. I took the girls and what few belongings we could carry, and we left. And you've been running ever since, Cade said quietly. Violet nodded, not meeting his eyes. I tried to find legitimate placement. I went to orphanages, aid societies, church groups. Everyone said the same thing. They couldn't take two sisters together, and I had no legal standing to make demands about their care. Some wanted to separate them immediately, send Poppy to one home, May to another. I couldn't let that happen. So I kept them with me, moved from place to place, took whatever work I could find that would allow me to keep them close. Mrs. Whitmore's affidavit claims you've been deceiving people, Sheriff Bridger said, pulling out the document Helena had left. Says you've been telling people they're your daughters. I never claimed they were my daughters by birth, Violet said, her voice gaining strength. But they are mine in every way that matters. I've cared for them since they were babies. I've fed them, clothed them, taught them to read and write. I've sat up with them through nightmares and illness. I've been their mother in everything but name because their real mother asked me to be. That's not deception, Sheriff. That's love. The room fell silent. From the corner, May's voice piped up, small but clear. Violet is our mother. She's the only one we have. Poppy stood, moving to the table with her characteristic directness. If that mean lady tries to take us, we'll run away. We'll keep running until we're old enough to decide for ourselves. Poppy, Violet started, but the girl cut her off. I mean it. She didn't care about us when Mama was alive. She didn't come when Papa died. She didn't look for us when we had nowhere to go. She only showed up now because... Poppy's voice wavered slightly. Because she wants to punish Violet for being Papa's real daughter. The one he should have had with his first wife. She's not doing this for us. She's doing it to be cruel. Sheriff Bridger studied the girl with something like respect in his weathered face. That's a heavy accusation from someone so young. That doesn't make it wrong, Poppy shot back. The sheriff's mouth twitched with what might have been a suppressed smile. No, I suppose it doesn't. He turned back to Violet. Here's the situation as I see it. Mrs. Whitmore has legal standing as a blood relative. You have no formal legal claim to these children. In a court, that puts you at a disadvantage. Violet's face went pale, but she nodded. She'd known this was coming. However, the sheriff continued, his tone thoughtful, the law also considers the best interests of the children, and from what I can see, these girls are well cared for, healthy, educated, and clearly attached to you. That counts for something. Additionally, Mrs. Whitmore's sudden interest after years of absence raises questions about her motives. So what do we do? Cade asked, his voice rough with barely controlled frustration. We document everything. Violet, I'll need you to write out a full account of your relationship to these girls, their parents' wishes, and the circumstances that brought you here. Get statements from anyone who knew you in San Antonio, anyone who can testify to your care of these children. And Cade, the sheriff's gaze shifted. I'll need to know your role in this, why you're housing them, what your intentions are, whether this is a temporary arrangement or something more permanent. It's permanent, Cade said without hesitation. They're part of my household. I've offered Miss Sloan employment as my housekeeper and guardian to the girls. They're under my protection. That helps, but it's not enough to counter blood relation claims. Sheriff Bridger stood, collecting his hat. I'll do what I can to slow this down, give you time to build a case. But I'll be straight with you. Mrs. Whitmore has money and connections. She'll bring in lawyers from Austin or even Houston if she has to. You'll need to be prepared for a real fight. After the sheriff left, the house felt smaller somehow, the walls pressing in with the weight of impending conflict. Violet sat at the table long after the others had moved away, staring at the blank paper Sheriff Bridger had left for her statement. Cade watched her from across the room, noting the rigid set of her shoulders, the way her hands kept clenching and unclenching in her lap. You should have told me, he said finally, about being their half-sister. Violet's head snapped up. Would it have changed your decision to let us stay? I don't know. Maybe, but you should have given me the choice. I gave you all the truth that mattered, she said, her voice hard with defensive anger. They're in my care. I love them. I'll do anything to protect them. Those are the important facts, Cade. The rest is just complications. Complications that are about to tear this household apart. He moved closer, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. I can't help you if you keep hiding things. If there are more secrets, more surprises waiting to jump out and bite us, I need to know now. Violet's eyes flashed. You want more secrets? Fine. My mother died of consumption in a charity ward because no doctor would treat a poor seamstress. I spent 4 years in a home where they taught us that we were worthless, that our only value was in serving others without complaint. I watched Thomas Hartwell pretend I didn't exist in public while privately asking if I'd like a real family, as if he could erase 20 years of abandonment with employment and false kindness. Her voice had risen, words tumbling out with the force of long-suppressed fury. I've been called bastard, whore, thief, liar. I've been told I'm not good enough, not legitimate enough, not worthy enough to exist in polite society. And then I found Margaret and the girls, and for the first time in my entire life, someone looked at me like I mattered, like I was family. And when she died, I promised I wouldn't let them suffer the way I did, wouldn't let them grow up feeling unwanted and ashamed. So yes, I have secrets, Cade. I have a whole lifetime of them. But none of them changed the fact that I would die before I let Helena Whitmore take those girls. The silence after her outburst was deafening. Violet's chest heaved with the force of her breathing, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She looked raw, exposed, every carefully constructed defense stripped away. Cade reached across the table and took her hand. She flinched but didn't pull away. Then we fight, he said simply. Whatever it takes. We fight. Violet stared at their joined hands, his rough and scarred from years of hard work, hers smaller but no less marked by labor. Why? She whispered. Why would you risk so much for us? Because you're brave and fierce, and you've survived things that would have broken most people, Cade thought. Because those girls deserve to grow up with someone who loves them, not someone who sees them as property or pawns. Because this house has been dead for too long, and you three brought it back to life. Because somewhere in the past 2 weeks, you stopped being strangers and started being something else, something I'm not ready to put a name to but can't bear to lose. But what he said was, because it's right. Now stop asking questions and start writing that statement. We have work to do. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation and mounting tension. Violet wrote her statement, then rewrote it 3 times at Cade's insistence until every detail was clear and defensible. Cade sent telegrams to San Antonio, tracking down anyone who'd known the Hartwell family, requesting statements about Violet's character and her relationship with the girls. The responses that trickled back were encouraging. A neighbor who remembered Violet's devoted care, a shopkeeper who testified to her integrity, even the pastor who'd presided at Margaret's funeral and noted that she'd specifically named Violet as guardian in her final wishes. But Helena Whitmore wasn't idle either. On the third day, a man arrived from Austin, slick-suited, sharp-eyed, carrying a leather case full of documents. He introduced himself as James Quentin Rockwell, attorney at law, and Cade's stomach dropped as he registered the last name. "Cousin," Quentin said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Been a long time." Cade stood on his porch, blocking the entrance to his house, every muscle tense. "What are you doing here, Quentin?" "Business, I'm afraid. I represent Mrs. Helena Whitmore in a rather delicate family matter." Quentin's gaze drifted past Cade to where Violet stood visible through the doorway. "I believe you're harboring 2 minor children who legally belong in Mrs. Whitmore's custody. I'm here to facilitate their peaceful transfer and avoid any unpleasant legal complications." "They're not going anywhere," Cade said flatly. But Cade, you see, they must. Mrs. Whitmore has legal standing, blood relation, and the financial means to provide these children with advantages you," he gestured at the ranch with barely concealed contempt, "could never offer. Quality education, social connections, proper marriage prospects. Surely even you can see that a remote cattle ranch is no place for young girls of good breeding." "They're happy here," Violet said, stepping onto the porch. Her voice was steady, but Cade could see the tremor in her hands. "They're safe, cared for, and loved. That's more than Helena Whitmore can offer." Quentin's smile sharpened. "Miss Sloane, is it? Or should I say Miss Hartwell? Though I suppose you don't have legal claim to that name either, do you? Illegitimacy is such an unfortunate circumstance." He pulled papers from his case with theatrical precision. "I have here documentation of Mrs. Whitmore's blood relation to the children, character references from Boston's finest society members, and letters from 3 separate institutions willing to testify to your unsuitable living arrangements. I also have," he paused for effect, "evidence of fraud. You've been representing yourself as these children's mother, when in fact you have no legal connection to them whatsoever." "That, Miss Sloane, is kidnapping." "That's a damn lie," Cade growled. "Is it? Can you produce adoption papers, legal guardianship documents, any formal recognition of Miss Sloane's authority over these children?" Quentin's eyebrows rose in mock inquiry. "No, I thought not, which means every day she's kept them from their rightful family is another day of criminal activity." "Get off my land," Cade said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "I'll leave, cousin, but I'll be back with the sheriff and a court order, and when I return, those children will be leaving with me." Quentin tipped his hat to Violet with exaggerated courtesy. "Mrs. Whitmore is a generous woman, Miss Sloane. She's willing to forget this unpleasantness if you surrender the children voluntarily. She'll even provide you with a reference for future employment, though I'd suggest you seek positions that don't involve childcare." He climbed into his buggy, but before driving off, he turned back with an expression of calculated concern. "Oh, and Cade? You might want to have your property documents reviewed. I've been going through county records, and there seem to be some interesting irregularities regarding your water rights and mineral claims. Father's estate was never properly settled after his death, and as his nephew, I have certain legal interests that may need to be addressed. We should talk about that. Privately." Then he was gone, leaving a trail of dust and implied threats in his wake. Violet swayed slightly, and Cade caught her elbow to steady her. He can't actually charge me with kidnapping, can he?" "He can try. Whether it would stick is another matter." Cade's mind was racing, trying to process both threats at once. Quentin's interest in his land wasn't coincidental. His cousin had been sniffing around the ranch's borders for years, convinced there was money to be made from the mineral rights or water access. But this timing, connecting it to the custody battle, that was strategic. "He's going to use this against us," Violet said, her voice hollow. "He'll make me look like a criminal, make you look complicit, and the court will have no choice but to give the girls to Helena." "Not if we move first." Cade turned to her, an idea forming with reckless speed. "We need to change the situation. Make it harder for them to separate you from the girls." "How?" "We've already gathered statements, documented everything. That's not enough. We need to make you family, legally." He paused, letting the words settle between them. "We need to get married." Violet stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "What?" "Think about it. As my wife, you'd have legal standing. The girls would be under my protection as your husband. Quentin can't claim you're unfit or unsuitable if you're a married woman with a stable home, and Helena's blood relation claim gets a lot weaker when you're part of an established family unit. Cade, that's insane. You can't marry someone just to win a legal battle. Why not? People get married for worse reasons. Money, property, convenience. At least this would be for something that matters. He could see her wavering, see the desperate hope fighting with practical resistance. It doesn't have to be real, Violet. Not in the ways that matter to you. We can keep separate rooms, maintain whatever distance you need. But on paper, to the law, you'd be Mrs. Rockwell. And those girls would be as good as mine. You don't know what you're offering, Violet said, her voice breaking. Marriage is permanent, Cade. You can't throw that away on a legal strategy that might not even work. Who says I'm throwing it away? The words came out rougher than he'd intended, carrying weight he hadn't meant to reveal. You've been here nearly 3 weeks. In that time, this house has felt more like home than it has in a decade. Those girls have brought life back to a place that was slowly dying. And you— He stopped, struggling with articulation. You work harder than anyone I've ever known. You don't complain, don't make demands, don't expect more than you've earned. You're raising 2 children who aren't yours by blood because you promised someone you loved that you'd protect them. What exactly about that makes you unsuitable for marriage? Violet's eyes had filled with tears. I'm illegitimate, Cade. Unmarriageable by society's standards. If you do this, you'll be tying yourself to someone with a shameful past, no connections, nothing to offer but complications. I don't give a damn about society's standards. Never have. He moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, close enough to count the freckles the Texas sun had brought out across her nose. Here's what I know. Those girls need you. You need protection from people like Helena Whitmore and my snake of a cousin, and I need— He paused, surprised by the truth of what he was about to say. I need this house to keep breathing the way it has been. I need to know that when I come back from the far pastures, there'll be voices and laughter and someone who cares whether I made it home safe. That's not love, Violet whispered. That's just need. Maybe, but it's honest. And it's more than most people start with. He took her hand again, feeling the calluses that matched his own. I'm not offering you romance, Violet. I'm not going to pretend I'm some kind of hero riding in to save you. But I can offer you partnership, respect, protection, a legal standing that Helena Whitmore can't easily break, and a home for those girls that nobody can take away. From inside the house, Poppy's voice called out, Violet, is everything all right? Violet closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them again, Cade saw the moment she made her decision, saw the desperate hope win out over practical resistance, saw the fighter in her rise up one more time. All right, she said quietly. If you're sure, if you really mean this, then yes, I'll marry you. The words should have felt momentous, earth-shattering. Instead, they settled over Cade with the simple rightness of a decision long overdue. We'll do it tomorrow. I'll ride to town first thing, get the license, find a judge willing to perform the ceremony. Can you be ready by afternoon? Violet laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. Ready? Cade, I own 2 dresses and a pair of boots. I'm about as ready as I'll ever be. That's all you need. He squeezed her hand once, then released it. Go tell the girls. They should hear it from you first. Violet nodded and turned toward the house, but at the door she paused. Cade, thank you for fighting for us. For this. I know it's just a strategy, but thank you. She disappeared inside before he could tell her that somewhere along the way it had stopped being just a strategy, that the thought of Helena Whitmore taking those girls, of Violet disappearing from his life as suddenly as she'd entered it, had become physically painful, that he'd realized, watching Quentin threaten everything he'd built, that his carefully constructed isolation had been nothing but slow starvation, and he was tired of being hungry. But those were thoughts for later. Right now, he had a wedding to arrange and a battle to prepare for, because he had no illusions about what was coming. Helena Whitmore wouldn't give up easily, and Quentin's threats about the ranch weren't empty posturing. His cousin had clearly been digging, looking for leverage, and the mention of property irregularities wasn't something Cade could ignore. He'd spent the years since the war building this ranch into something solid, something that couldn't be taken away by circumstances or cruel fate. Now he was going to have to defend it on two fronts: in court for Violet's right to the girls, and through legal channels for his own right to the land he'd bled for. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd chosen isolation to avoid exactly this kind of complication. And now he was about to deliberately bind himself to the very thing he'd been running from: family, with all its messy entanglements and impossible demands. But as he stood on his porch watching the sun sink toward the horizon, Cade found he didn't regret it. Whatever was coming, whatever fight lay ahead, at least he wouldn't be facing it alone. And maybe, he thought, that was worth more than all the peace and quiet in the world. Inside he could hear Violet's voice, low and serious, explaining to the girls what was going to happen. May's excited squeal carried through the open window, followed by Poppy's more measured response. Questions probably, because Poppy always had questions. Then Violet's patient answers, steady and calm despite everything. Cade smiled slightly and headed toward the barn. The horses needed tending, the cattle needed checking, and tomorrow would come whether he was ready for it or not. Might as well make sure the ranch work was handled before his entire life changed. Again. Though this time he suspected the change might actually be for the better, even if it terrified him more than anything had in years. The wedding, if it could be called that, took place in Judge Harrison's chambers at precisely 2 o'clock the following afternoon. Violet wore her best dress, the gray wool she'd arrived in, cleaned and pressed until it looked almost respectable. May had woven wildflowers into her braid that morning, yellow and purple blooms that softened the severity of her appearance. Poppy stood beside her in somber silence, holding May's hand with white-knuckled intensity. Cade had worn his cleanest shirt and the jacket he kept for funerals and bank meetings, feeling stiff and ridiculous in clothes that didn't smell of horses and honest sweat. Sheriff Bridger stood as witness, along with Jed from the ranch, both men wearing expressions that suggested they understood exactly what this hasty marriage really was: a legal maneuver, a defensive strategy, a last desperate play before the enemy closed in. Judge Harrison was a practical man who'd seen enough frontier marriages to know that love was a luxury most couldn't afford. He kept the ceremony mercifully brief, his voice flat and official as he recited the words that would bind them. Do you, Cade Rockwell, take this woman? Do you, Violet Sloan, take this man? The promises made, to honor, to cherish, in sickness and health, felt both weightless and impossibly heavy. When the judge pronounced them married and suggested Cade might kiss his bride, there was a moment of awkward hesitation. Then Cade leaned forward and pressed a chaste kiss to Violet's forehead, brief and almost brotherly, before stepping back. Violet's eyes had closed at the contact, and when she opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. Well then, Judge Harrison said, signing the certificate with a flourish. Mrs. Rockwell, you and your husband have my congratulations, and my prayers, considering the storm that's headed your way. You've heard about Mrs. Whitmore's intentions? Cade asked. Hard not to. She's been making noise all over town, hiring that fancy lawyer, telling anyone who'll listen about the injustice of stolen children. The judge handed over the marriage certificate, properly witnessed and sealed. But this changes things. You're a married couple now, established household, respectable standing in the community. That counts for something in custody matters. Doesn't guarantee victory, but it counts. They left the courthouse as husband and wife, the certificate folded carefully in Cade's pocket like ammunition for the battle ahead. The girls climbed into the wagon bed, May chattering excitedly about how Violet was now Mrs. Rockwell. And didn't that sound grand, while Poppy remained quiet, her sharp eyes watching the adults with an understanding far beyond her years. The ride back to the ranch was subdued. Spring sunshine painted the prairie in shades of gold and green, wildflowers nodding in the breeze, but the beauty felt disconnected from the tension coiled in Cade's chest. Beside him, Violet sat ramrod straight, her hands folded in her lap, her new wedding ring, a simple gold band Cade had purchased that morning, catching the light. You didn't have to buy a ring, she said quietly, so the girls wouldn't hear. Yes, I did. People notice things like that. Helena's lawyers will be looking for any detail they can use to prove this marriage isn't legitimate. Is it? Violet turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. Legitimate, I mean. We stood before a judge and said words, but we both know why we did it. Does that count as real? Cade kept his eyes on the road, his hand steady on the reins. Real enough to hold up in court. That's all that matters right now. Right. Violet's voice had gone flat. That's all that matters. They completed the journey in silence, but Cade felt the weight of unspoken words pressing against his ribs. He'd meant what he said in the judge's chambers, the promises to honor and cherish, even if they'd been spoken as legal strategy. He just didn't know how to explain that to someone who'd spent her whole life being told she wasn't worth keeping. The ranch came into view, sturdy and solid against the endless Texas sky, and something in Cade's chest loosened slightly. This was home. This was worth fighting for. And now, legally and officially, Violet and the girls were part of it. They'd barely unhitched the wagon when riders appeared on the eastern road, 3 of them, moving fast. Cade recognized Quentin's buggy flanked by 2 hired men, rough-looking characters who were clearly there for intimidation rather than legal purposes. Get the girls inside, Cade said quietly to Violet. Stay there until I call for you. Cade, inside. Now. Violet gathered the girls without argument, herding them toward the house. Poppy cast one long look back at Cade, her expression fierce and frightened in equal measure, before the door closed behind them. Cade stood alone in his yard, waiting, his body loose and ready. Jed had stayed after the ceremony and now emerged from the barn, rifle held casually but available. Sheriff Bridger had mentioned he'd patrol near the ranch this afternoon, and sure enough, Cade spotted the lawman's horse approaching from the southern boundary. Quentin pulled up in a cloud of dust, his expensive suit somehow still immaculate despite the road. His hired men dismounted on either side, hands resting on gun belts in a manner that was just shy of openly threatening. "Cousin," Quentin called out with false cheer. "Congratulations are in order, I hear. Married just this afternoon. How romantically impulsive." "State your business, Quentin, then get off my land." "My business is simple. I'm here on behalf of Mrs. Whitmore to collect her nieces. She has legal custody papers, properly filed and approved. The children are to come with me immediately. Those children are under my protection now, as my wife's sisters, their family. You'll need more than papers to take them." Quentin's smile sharpened. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong. You see, I did some digging after our last conversation. Very enlightening, the county records. Did you know your father's estate was never properly probated? That his will, such as it was, contained certain ambiguities about property division? As his nephew and closest male relative after your brothers left the territory, I have a legitimate claim to portions of this ranch. Specifically," he pulled out yet another document, "the water rights associated with the Southern Creek and the mineral claims on the northern ridge." Cade's jaw clenched so hard he felt his teeth grind. "That's a lie. My father left this ranch to me, clear and legal." "Did he? Or did he leave it to his sons, plural, with the expectation you'd divide it fairly? Because your brothers never formally signed away their claims, Cade, which means, technically, you've been operating this ranch without clear title for years. I've already filed paperwork contesting your ownership of key portions. Unless—" Quentin's pause was theatrical. "Unless we can come to an arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Sheriff Bridger's voice cut through the tension. He'd ridden up quietly, positioning his horse between Quentin's men and Cade. "Because it sounds to me like you're attempting extortion, Mr. Rockwell. That's a serious crime." "Extortion? Sheriff, I'm simply trying to resolve a family dispute. My cousin is harboring children that don't belong to him, married a woman under questionable circumstances, and is holding property that may not be entirely his to hold. I'm offering a peaceful solution. He releases the children to their rightful guardian, and I withdraw my property claims. Everyone benefits." "Except the children," Sheriff Bridger said flatly. "And the woman who's been caring for them for months, and your cousin, who'd lose both his family and his land. Some peaceful solution." Quentin's expression hardened, the veneer of civility cracking. "This is a legal matter, Sheriff. Unless you have evidence of wrongdoing, I suggest you stay out of it. I have evidence of a properly executed marriage between 2 consenting adults, making Miss Sloan, Mrs. Rockwell, a legal resident of this ranch with full rights to her family. I also have testimony from multiple witnesses about your client Mrs. Whitmore's lack of previous interest in these children's welfare. And I'm developing a very strong suspicion that your property claims are convenient fabrications designed to pressure my friend into surrendering custody. The sheriff's hand rested on his gun belt, casual but clear. Now you can leave peacefully and pursue your claims through proper legal channels, or I can arrest you for trespassing and threatening behavior. Your choice. One of Quentin's hired men shifted his weight, and instantly Jed's rifle came up, not quite aimed, but definitely ready. The tension ratcheted up another notch, the afternoon air suddenly thick with the possibility of violence. "This isn't over," Quentin said, his voice low and venomous. "Mrs. Whitmore has resources you can't match. She'll bury you in legal fees, drag this through every court in Texas if necessary. And while you're fighting her, I'll be dismantling your claim to this ranch piece by piece. You'll lose everything, cousin. Everything." "Maybe," Cade said quietly. "But not today. Get off my land, Quentin, while you still can." For a long moment, Quentin held his gaze, calculating odds and risks. Then he gestured to his men and climbed back into his buggy. "You have 1 week to reconsider. After that, Mrs. Whitmore files formal custody proceedings, and I file formal property claims. Think very carefully about whether you want to fight both battles simultaneously." They left in another cloud of dust, and Cade felt his knees go slightly weak with the release of adrenaline. Jed lowered his rifle with a long exhale, and Sheriff Bridger dismounted, his weathered face grave. "He's not bluffing about the legal assault," the sheriff said. "Helena Whitmore has money and connections. She can afford to drag this through courts for years. And if Quentin's property claims have any validity at all—" "They don't," Cade interrupted. "My father's will was clear. This ranch is mine." "Then you need to prove it. Get a lawyer, review all the documents, make sure there aren't any loopholes Quentin can exploit, because he will exploit them, Cade. He's wanted this land for years, and now he's found leverage." Cade nodded, his mind already racing through logistics. A lawyer meant money, which he had some of, but not unlimited amounts. Court proceedings meant time away from the ranch, which meant hiring extra hands or letting work slide. And all of it meant uncertainty, stress, the constant threat hanging over everything they were trying to build. The door to the house opened, and Violet emerged, pale but composed. The girls stayed inside, their faces visible through the window. Violet walked across the yard to stand beside Cade, and without thinking, he reached for her hand. She took it, her fingers cold despite the warm afternoon. "How bad is it?" she asked quietly. "Bad, but not impossible." Cade looked at the sheriff. "What do we need to do to fight this properly?" "First, get all your documentation in order. Birth certificates for the girls, marriage license, property deeds, everything. Second, find a lawyer who specializes in both custody and property law. Third," the sheriff hesitated, "prepare for this to get ugly. Helena Whitmore will drag up every piece of dirt she can find. Violet's illegitimacy, your father's past, anything that can be used to paint you as unfit guardians. You need to be ready for that." "We're ready," Violet said, her voice steady. "We've been ready since the moment she walked into this house and tried to take my girls." Sheriff Bridger nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit. I'll do what I can from my end. Document the threatening behavior, make sure the court knows about the coercion tactics. But ultimately, this will come down to what a judge decides is in those children's best interest." After the sheriff left, Cade and Violet stood together in the yard, still holding hands, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon. Inside, May's voice called out asking if they could come outside now, and Poppy's lower tones responding, telling her to wait just a little longer. "I'm sorry," Violet said suddenly. "This is my fault. If I'd been honest from the beginning, if I'd found a better solution, you wouldn't be losing your ranch because of me." "I'm not losing it," Cade said firmly. "And you didn't cause this. Quentin's been looking for an angle to take this land for years. You just gave him an excuse to try, but that doesn't mean he'll succeed. But if you have to choose, if it comes down to the ranch or us—" Cade turned to face her fully, his free hand coming up to tilt her chin so she had to meet his eyes. "It won't come to that. We're not giving up the girls. And I'm not giving up this land. We fight for both, together." "Why?" Violet's voice broke slightly. "Why are you doing this? You barely know us. We're nothing to you but trouble and complications." "You're my wife," Cade said simply. "They're my family now. That means something. Maybe I don't know how to say it right. Maybe I'm no good at pretty words or grand gestures, but I know how to stand my ground. I know how to fight for what's mine. And whether you believe it or not, Violet, you're mine now. All three of you. So we're going to figure this out, and we're going to win, and then we're going to build something here that nobody can take away. A tear slid down Violet's cheek, catching the fading sunlight. I want to believe that. Then believe it. I haven't lied to you yet, have I? No, she admitted. You haven't. Then trust me now. He wiped the tear away with his thumb, the gesture surprisingly tender for a man with such rough hands. We've got a week before they file. That's enough time to get organized, to gather evidence, to prepare our defense. And we're not alone in this. Sheriff Bridger's on our side. The hands will testify to your character if needed. Half the town knows you've been caring for those girls like they were your own. Half the town also knows I'm illegitimate, that I have no legal claim to them, that this marriage happened awfully fast after Helena showed up. Half the town also knows that quick marriages are common on the frontier, that blood relation isn't the same as genuine care, and that Helena Whitmore showed up out of nowhere demanding children she'd ignored for years. Public opinion counts for something, Violet, especially in a small community like this. Violet nodded slowly, absorbing this, trying to find her footing again after being knocked sideways by Quentin's threats. What do we do first? First, we tell the girls the truth. All of it. They're old enough to understand, and they deserve to know what's coming. May will be terrified. May will be terrified either way. Better she hears it from us than from some lawyer in a courtroom. Cade squeezed her hand once, then released it. Come on, let's get this over with. They gathered in the main room, all four of them, the evening light slanting through windows and painting everything in shades of amber. May curled up in Violet's lap, her doll clutched tight. Poppy sat straight-backed in a chair, her hands folded in her lap, already bracing for bad news. Cade explained the situation in terms they could understand, that Helena wanted to take them away, that Quentin was trying to use the ranch as leverage, that there would be a court hearing where a judge would decide where they belonged. He didn't sugarcoat it, but he didn't make it more frightening than necessary. Will we have to talk to the judge? Poppy asked when he finished. Probably he'll want to hear from you about where you want to live. Then we'll tell him we want to stay here, with you and Violet, with our family. Poppy's voice was fierce, absolute. It might not be that simple, sweetheart, Violet said gently. The judge has to consider lots of things. Like what? Like the fact that Aunt Helena didn't care about us until now? Like the fact that you're the only one who's taken care of us since Mama died? Like the fact that Cade married you to keep us safe? Poppy's eyes were bright with unshed tears. We're not stupid, you know. We understand what's happening, and we're not going with her. We won't. We'll run away if we have to. You will not run away, Cade said firmly, because we're going to win this fight. But I need you both to promise me something. No matter what happens in that courtroom, no matter what people say about Violet or about me or about our family, you stay calm and you tell the truth. Can you do that? Poppy nodded slowly. May just burrowed deeper into Violet's arms, her small voice muffled. I don't want to leave. This is home now. I know, baby, Violet whispered, pressing her face into May's hair. I know. The week that followed was a blur of preparation and mounting dread. Kate hired a lawyer from Austin, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Chen, who specialized in family law and had a reputation for taking cases others considered unwinnable. She arrived on the third day, spent 6 hours reviewing documents and interviewing everyone, then delivered her assessment with brutal honesty. You have a case, she said, sitting at Cade's kitchen table with papers spread before her. Not a strong one, but a case. The marriage helps significantly, establishes Violet as a respectable married woman rather than an unwed guardian. Cade's standing in the community helps. The testimony about Helena's absence and Violet's devoted care helps. But, she paused significantly. Helena has blood relation, financial resources, and social standing. In custody disputes, blood still matters a great deal to most judges. So what do we do? Violet asked, her hands twisted together so tightly the knuckles had gone white. We tell your story. All of it. We make the judge see that you're not some opportunistic stranger who stole children. You're their sister, their mother, and everything but legal documentation, the person their own mother chose to protect them. We humanize this. Make it about the girl's well-being, not about legal technicalities. And the property dispute? Kate asked. That's trickier. I've reviewed the documents Quentin filed. His claims are largely groundless. Your father's will is clear enough, and your brother signed quitclaim deeds years ago. But he's found some ambiguities in the water rights documentation and the mineral survey. Nothing that would actually hold up in court, but enough to cause expensive delays and legal complications. My guess is he's using it as pressure, hoping you'll trade custody for clear property title. That's not happening, Cade said flatly. I didn't think so. Which means we fight both battles. Margaret Chen gathered her papers with efficient movements. The hearing is in 4 days. I'll prepare opening statements and witness lists. In the meantime, I need you both to write out complete timelines of your relationship with these children. Every detail, every moment that shows the depth of your connection. And I need character witnesses, people who can testify to your fitness as guardians. Over the next days, the ranch became a headquarters for their defense. Sheriff Bridger came by with additional statements. Jed and the other hands wrote testimonials about the girl's care and the positive changes in the household. The pastor from town agreed to testify about Violet's regular church attendance and moral character. Even the shopkeeper and the school teacher, though May and Poppy had only attended a few times, offered supportive statements. Through it all, Violet moved with mechanical precision, doing what needed to be done while some essential part of her seemed to have gone numb. She cooked, cleaned, cared for the girls, wrote her timeline in careful script that grew less steady as she reached the parts about Margaret's death and Thomas's final words. At night, Cade could hear her crying through the thin wall that separated their rooms, quiet, contained sobs that she tried to muffle so the girls wouldn't hear. He wanted to go to her, to offer comfort, or at least companionship, but he'd promised her space, promised this marriage could be whatever she needed it to be, and barging into her room in the middle of the night didn't feel like honoring that promise. So he lay awake on his side of the wall, listening to her grief, and felt helpless in a way that work and determination couldn't fix. On the night before the hearing, Cade found Violet sitting on the porch long after everyone else had gone to bed. She'd wrapped herself in a shawl against the cooling air, and her eyes were fixed on the stars scattered across the vast Texas sky. "Can't sleep?" he asked, settling onto the step beside her. "Don't want to. Feels like if I stay awake I can keep tomorrow from coming. Doesn't work that way, unfortunately." "I know." Violet pulled the shawl tighter. "I keep thinking about what Margaret Chen said, that we have to humanize this, make it about the girl's well-being. But what if that's not enough? What if the judge looks at me and just sees what Helena wants him to see? A bastard pretending to be something she's not. A woman with no rights trying to claim children who don't belong to her. Is that what you think you are?" "It's what I've been told I am my entire life." Cade was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "When I came back from the war, I was broken in ways I couldn't explain. Lost friends, lost my faith in pretty much everything, couldn't see the point of trying to build something when it could all be destroyed so easily. I came back here and threw myself into the ranch because it was something I could control, something that made sense when nothing else did." He paused, staring out at the dark shapes of his cattle in the distance. "But you know what I learned? You can't live your whole life avoiding risk just because you've been hurt before. You can't let the worst parts of your past define who you are forever. At some point, you have to decide you're worth more than what other people said about you, that you deserve better than what you've been given." Violet turned to look at him, her face half-shadowed in the moonlight. "Is that what you've done? Decided you're worth more?" "I'm working on it. Having you three here, that's helped. Made me remember that isolation isn't the same thing as safety, that sometimes the risk is worth it. Even when the risk is losing everything? Especially then." Cade met her eyes, willing her to hear what he was trying to say. "Tomorrow, we go into that courtroom and we tell the truth. We show that judge what family really means. Not blood, not legal documents, but the choice to show up every day and love someone even when it's hard. Even when it costs you. That's what you've done for those girls, Violet. That's what makes you their mother." "And what does it make you, Sam?" she asked softly. The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications. What was Cade to these girls? Their protector, certainly. Their provider. The man who'd married their guardian to keep them safe. But was that the same as being a father? Did signing papers and standing before a judge make him family, or did it require something more? I don't know yet, he said honestly, but I'd like the chance to find out. Violet's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers lacing through his with surprising firmness. They sat like that for a long time, not speaking, just holding on while the night deepened around them and tomorrow loomed closer with every passing star. Inside, May cried out in her sleep, and they heard Poppy's voice, low and soothing, comforting her sister. The sound of it, of these children caring for each other, of the family they'd built from broken pieces, strengthened something in Cade's chest. Tomorrow they would fight. Tomorrow they would face judges and lawyers and people who wanted to tear this fragile thing apart. But tonight, they were together. Tonight, they were home. And that, Cade thought, was worth fighting for with everything he had, even if he couldn't quite bring himself to say it out loud yet. Dawn arrived too quickly, washing the Texas sky in shades of pale gold that felt inappropriate for the weight of the day ahead. Cade rose before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, his body moving through morning routines with mechanical precision while his mind churned through every possible outcome of the hearing. He found Violet already in the kitchen, her hair pinned back with unusual severity, wearing her best dress, the one she'd been married in, cleaned and pressed again until it looked almost formal. "Coffee's ready," she said without turning around. Her voice was steady, but Cade could see the tremor in her hands as she poured. "The girls?" "Still sleeping. I thought I'd let them rest as long as possible. Margaret said we need to be at the courthouse by 9. Cade accepted the coffee she handed him, noting the dark circles under her eyes that suggested she'd gotten even less sleep than he had. "We're going to get through this." "You keep saying that." "Because it's true." Violet set down her own cup with more force than necessary, the china rattling against the table. "You don't know that, Cade. You can't promise me that. What if the judge decides blood matters more than love? What if he looks at Helena's money and status and decides that's what's best for them? What if—" Her voice cracked, and she pressed her hands flat against the table, steadying herself. "What if I lose them? What if this is our last morning together?" Cade moved around the table and did something he'd been wanting to do for days. He pulled her into his arms, feeling her stiffen with surprise before gradually relaxing against his chest. She was smaller than she seemed when she was putting on that fierce, determined front, her head barely reaching his shoulder. He could feel her heart hammering against his ribs. "Then we'll appeal," he said quietly into her hair. "And if we lose the appeal, we'll find another way. But I'm not giving up, Violet. Not on those girls, and not on you. So you don't get to give up either." She was crying now, silent tears dampening his shirt, her shoulders shaking with the force of emotion she'd been holding back for days. Cade just held her, offering no empty platitudes or false promises, just the solid reality of his presence and his refusal to let go. Eventually she pulled back, wiping at her eyes with shaking hands. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't. This isn't your burden to carry." "The hell it isn't. I married you, didn't I? That makes it my burden too." He caught her hand, the one wearing his ring, and held it between both of his. "We're in this together, Violet. For better or worse, remember? And this—" he gestured at the weight pressing down on both of them. "This is definitely the worse part. But we're still standing, still fighting." A small, watery smile crossed her face. "When did you become so good with words?" "I'm not. I'm just saying what's true." He released her hand reluctantly. "Go wake the girls. Get them ready. I'll hitch the wagon." The courthouse sat in the center of town, an imposing brick structure that looked far too official for the rough frontier community it served. By the time they arrived, a small crowd had already gathered, curious townspeople drawn by gossip, supporters who'd come to testify, and Helena Whitmore herself, resplendent in black silk that must have cost more than most families earned in a year. She stood on the courthouse steps flanked by Quentin and 2 other men in expensive suits, her lawyers, presumably, imported from Austin or Houston to overwhelm the local proceedings with big city sophistication. Her eyes found Violet as the wagon pulled up, and her expression shifted into something that might have been triumph if it hadn't been so cold. "Mrs. Rockwell," Helena called out, the title dripping with sarcasm. "How lovely that you could make it to your own hearing. And you've brought the children, I see." "How convenient," They can leave with me directly, once the judge makes the sensible decision. Poppy's hand tightened on Violet so hard it must have hurt. May pressed her face into Cade's side, her small body trembling. Cade felt something fierce and protective surge through him, the same instinct that had kept him alive through the war, the same drive that had built this ranch from nothing. "They're not going anywhere with you," he said quietly, but his voice carried across the courthouse steps. "Not now, not ever." "We'll see what Judge Morrison has to say about that," Quentin interjected smoothly. "He's quite familiar with property law and family obligations. I'm confident he'll make the appropriate ruling on both matters." Margaret Chen appeared at that moment, her arms full of documents, her expression focused and determined. "Mr. and Mrs. Rockwell, girls, let's get inside. We have a lot to cover before the hearing begins." The courtroom was smaller than Cade had expected, with wooden benches worn smooth by years of use and windows that let in harsh morning light. Judge Morrison was already seated at the bench, a man in his 60s with iron-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He watched them file in with an expression of carefully maintained neutrality. The next hour passed in a blur of legal procedure. Helena's lawyers presented their case first, painting Violet as an opportunistic imposter who'd stolen children that didn't belong to her, hidden them away in a remote ranch, and manufactured a hasty marriage to avoid legal consequences. They produced birth certificates proving Helena's blood relation, letters from Boston Society members testifying to her impeccable character, and financial statements showing she could provide the girls with advantages far beyond what a frontier rancher and his questionable wife could offer. Through it all, Violet sat rigid beside Cade, her face pale but composed. Only the death grip she maintained on his hand revealed the terror beneath her calm exterior. Then it was Margaret Chen's turn. She stood and addressed the court with the confidence of someone who'd fought these battles before and won more often than she'd lost. "Your Honor, this case isn't about blood relation or financial resources. It's about what's best for two little girls who've already lost more than children should have to lose. Their parents died within days of each other, leaving them with nothing. No money, no home, no future. Mrs. Whitmore claims to be concerned about their welfare now, but where was she when they were grieving? Where was she when they had nowhere to sleep? Where was she during the 6 months Miss Sloane, now Mrs. Rockwell, sacrificed everything to keep them fed, clothed, and together?" Margaret moved to stand beside Violet, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "The answer is simple. She wasn't there. She didn't care until it became convenient, until she could use these children as weapons in a larger scheme to pressure Mr. Rockwell into surrendering valuable property. This isn't about family, Your Honor. It's about control and manipulation." Helena's lead lawyer shot to his feet. "Objection! Mrs. Whitmore's motives are not—" "Overruled," Judge Morrison said mildly. "I'll hear the full argument, Counselor. Continue, Ms. Chen." Margaret nodded and turned back to the judge. "Mrs. Rockwell has cared for these children with devotion that goes beyond duty. She's their sister by blood, their father's daughter from a previous relationship, which Mrs. Whitmore conveniently fails to mention. She's the person their mother chose as guardian on her deathbed, and she's the only mother these girls have known for the past 6 months. To tear them away now, to send them to a stranger in a strange city, would be cruel and traumatic. This court exists to protect children, not to serve the vindictive purposes of relatives who couldn't be bothered to care until it became legally advantageous." She returned to the table and pulled out a stack of documents. "I have testimony from Sheriff Bridger about Mrs. Whitmore's threatening behavior. Statements from Mr. Rockwell's ranch hands about the excellent care these children receive, letters from community members attesting to Mrs. Rockwell's character, and most importantly," Margaret looked directly at the judge, "I have the children themselves, who can tell you exactly where they want to be." Judge Morrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I'd like to hear from the children, but separately, without either party present. Bailiff, please prepare my chambers." Cade felt Violet tense beside him. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. If Poppy and May couldn't articulate their wishes clearly, if they broke down under questioning, if the judge decided they were too young to have meaningful input, "It'll be all right," he whispered to Violet. "They're strong. They know what to say." But watching Poppy and May disappear into the judge's chambers, their small hands clasped together, Cade felt his certainty waver. They were just children. How much weight could their testimony really carry against blood relations and legal precedent? The wait was excruciating. 20 minutes stretched into 30, then 45. Helena looked increasingly confident, whispering with her lawyers. Quentin kept glancing at Cade with barely concealed satisfaction, clearly anticipating victory on both fronts. Finally, the door opened. Judge Morrison emerged alone, his expression unreadable. He took a seat at the bench and surveyed the courtroom with measured deliberation. "I've spoken with both children at length," he said, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "They are articulate, intelligent, and remarkably clear about their feelings. Before I render my decision on the custody matter, however, I'd like to address the property dispute that seems to be entangled with this case." He turned his attention to Quentin. "Mr. Rockwell, the younger Mr. Rockwell, you've filed claims suggesting irregularities in your cousin's title to certain water rights and mineral claims. I've reviewed the documentation you submitted. I've also reviewed the original land grants, your uncle's will, and the quitclaim deed signed by Cade Rockwell's brothers. Your claims are without merit. The water rights are clearly assigned to the main ranch property, which your uncle left to his son Cade. The mineral survey you cite as ambiguous is no such thing. It clearly delineates the northern ridge as part of the primary parcel. Your attempt to contest these established property rights appears to be nothing more than harassment designed to create leverage in an unrelated custody dispute." Quentin's face had gone red. "Your Honor, if you'd allow me to—" "I've heard enough, Counselor. Your property claims are dismissed. If you file similar frivolous claims in the future, I'll hold you in contempt." Judge Morrison's gaze was steel. "As for you, Mrs. Whitmore, I have some questions." Helena straightened, her composure faltering slightly under the judge's scrutiny. "Of course, Your Honor. When was the last time you saw these children before arriving in Texas?" "I visited once, approximately 5 years ago." "And you maintained regular correspondence with their mother afterward? Inquired about their well-being? Sent gifts or financial support?" Helena's jaw tightened. "My sister and I were not close. Our lives had diverged." "So the answer is no. You had no contact with these children or their parents for 5 years. Yet when they became orphans, suddenly you developed a deep concern for their welfare. Why is that, Mrs. Whitmore?" "They are my blood, Your Honor. Family obligation." "Family obligation is a curious thing," Judge Morrison interrupted. "It seems to activate very selectively for some people. Tell me, if I were to grant you custody, what are your plans for these girls?" "I would take them to Boston, enroll them in proper schools, introduce them to appropriate society. Together?" Helena hesitated just for a moment, but it was enough. "Well, their ages and temperaments differ significantly. It might be more suitable to place them in separate educational environments. So you'd separate them." The judge's voice had gone flat. "These two little girls who've already lost their parents, who've been through upheaval and uncertainty, who clearly depend on each other, you'd tear them apart for the sake of suitable education? It would be in their best interests long term. Would it? Or would it simply be more convenient for you?" Judge Morrison leaned forward, his expression severe. "Mrs. Whitmore, I've been a judge for 23 years. I've seen a lot of custody disputes, heard a lot of arguments about what's best for children, and I've learned that blood relation doesn't automatically confer wisdom or love. Sometimes the people who fight hardest for custody are the ones who should never have it." He paused, letting his words settle over the courtroom. "I spoke with Poppy and May Hartwell this morning. Poppy is 7 years old, but she has the gravity of someone much older. Someone who's had to grow up too fast because life gave her no choice. May is 5, still young enough to believe in safety and belonging, but old enough to know when those things are threatened. And you know what they told me?" The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. Violet's hand in Cade's was trembling so hard he thought she might shatter. "They told me that Violet is their mother, not the woman who gave birth to them. They remember her fondly, speak of her with love. But the person who mothers them now, who sits up with them through nightmares, who teaches them their letters, who makes sure they feel wanted and safe. They told me that Cade is teaching them about horses and ranching and how to be strong when things are hard. They told me that their house has a garden with vegetables they helped plant and chickens they helped feed, and a porch where they sit together in the evenings and watch the stars." Judge Morrison's voice had softened slightly, but lost none of its authority. They also told me that they don't know you, Mrs. Whitmore, that the one time you visited, you said Poppy was too headstrong and May was too delicate, that you made their mother cry, and that they're terrified you'll separate them and send them away from the only home they have left. Helena had gone pale, her lawyer whispering urgently in her ear, but Judge Morrison wasn't finished. The law gives weight to blood relation in custody matters, but it also, and more importantly, gives weight to the best interests of the child. And in this case, those interests are clear. These girls are thriving under Mrs. Rockwell's care. They're healthy, educated, loved, and stable. They have a community that supports them, a home that welcomes them, and guardians who married specifically to protect them from being torn apart by relatives who couldn't be bothered to care when it actually mattered. He picked up his gavel, and Cade felt Violet stop breathing beside him. Therefore, I hereby deny Mrs. Whitmore's petition for custody. Legal guardianship of Poppy and May Hartwell is granted to Violet Rockwell, with full parental rights and responsibilities. Mrs. Whitmore, you are welcome to apply for visitation rights through proper channels, but I warn you, if you attempt to harass this family further or interfere with these children's stability, I will hold you in contempt and issue a restraining order. Am I clear? Helena's composure shattered completely. This is outrageous. Those children are my blood. Those children are safe, loved, and exactly where they belong, Judge Morrison said firmly. This hearing is concluded. The gavel fell, and the sound of it echoed through the courtroom like thunder. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Violet made a sound, half sob, half laugh, and turned to bury her face against Cade's shoulder. His arms came around her automatically, holding her while she shook with the force of relief and joy and residual terror all crashing together at once. "We won," she whispered against his shirt. "Oh God, Cade, we won." "I told you we would," he murmured back. Though his own voice was rough with emotion he hadn't expected to feel. Margaret Chen was grinning, gathering her documents with obvious satisfaction. Sheriff Bridger had appeared from somewhere in the back of the courtroom, his weathered face creased with approval. And then the door to the judge's chambers opened, and Poppy and May came running out, their faces bright with hope and uncertainty. "Violet?" Poppy's voice was small, scared to hope. "What happened? What did the judge say?" Violet pulled away from Cade and dropped to her knees, opening her arms. Both girls crashed into her, and she held them tight, tears streaming down her face. "We're staying together, all of us. You're mine, and nobody can take you away. Nobody." May started crying in earnest, happy tears that soaked into Violet's shoulder. Poppy held on with fierce intensity, her young face buried against Violet's neck. And Cade stood watching them, this fragile family he'd somehow become part of, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. This was what home felt like. Not the land or the house or the cattle, but this. These three people who'd stormed into his isolated life and refused to let him hide anymore. Helena swept past them toward the exit, her lawyers trailing behind, her face twisted with fury and humiliation. Quentin followed, pausing just long enough to shoot Cade a look of pure venom. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You may have won today, but it's over," Sheriff Bridger said pleasantly, materializing at Quentin's elbow. "And I'd suggest you leave town before I remember all the other charges I could file against you. Extortion, harassment, filing false legal claims. I'm sure I could come up with a few more if I put my mind to it." Quentin left without another word, and Cade felt the last thread of tension in his shoulders finally release. It was over. Really, truly over. Judge Morrison approached them as they prepared to leave. His stern judicial demeanor softened slightly. "Mrs. Rockwell," he said to Violet, who was still holding the girls, "those are exceptional children you have. Don't ever let anyone make you doubt your right to them." "I won't, Your Honor. Thank you. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me. Thank yourself for fighting when most people would have given up." He turned to Cade, extending his hand. "And you, Mr. Rockwell. You've taken on quite a responsibility." "Best decision I ever made," Cade said, shaking the judge's hand firmly. And as he said it, he realized it was true. Every complication, every threat, every moment of uncertainty, it had all been worth it to arrive at this moment. The ride back to the ranch was jubilant despite everyone's exhaustion. May chattered nonstop about how the judge had asked her about her doll and whether she liked feeding chickens. and how she'd told him that Cade was teaching them to be brave. Poppy was quieter but kept stealing glances at Cade and Violet with something that looked like cautious wonder, as if she was still afraid to fully believe this was real. By the time they pulled into the ranch yard, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of amber and rose. The hands emerged from the bunkhouse, and Jed took one look at their faces before letting out a whoop that startled the horses. "We won?" he called out. "We won!" May shouted back, her voice high and clear with joy. The celebration that followed was spontaneous and heartfelt. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey that had been saved for special occasions. The hands took turns congratulating Violet and shaking Cade's hand with grins that suggested they'd been rooting for this outcome all along. Even gruff Sam admitted that the ranch felt better with children around, though he'd deny it if anyone repeated that sentiment. As evening settled over the land, Cade found himself on the porch again, watching the prairie fade into twilight. Violet joined him after getting the girls settled for bed, moving to stand beside him at the railing. They were silent for a long moment, just existing together in the quiet aftermath of the storm they'd weathered. "I keep expecting to wake up," Violet said finally. "Keep expecting this to be a dream, or for someone to come take it all away. It's real. You're allowed to believe that now." "I don't know if I know how. I've spent so long waiting for the next disaster, the next loss." She turned to look at him, her eyes reflecting the last of the sunset. "You saved us, Cade. You know that, right? We would have lost without you. You would have found another way. You're too stubborn to give up. Maybe, but I wouldn't have had this." She gestured at the ranch, the house, the land stretching endlessly in every direction. "I wouldn't have had a real home to fight for, and I wouldn't have had—" She stopped, struggling with words. "Wouldn't have had what?" Cade prompted gently. "A partner. Someone who stood beside me instead of just feeling sorry for me or trying to fix me." Violet's voice had gone soft, vulnerable in a way he'd rarely heard. "You could have just offered us shelter, Cade. You could have let us stay as employees, kept your distance, avoided all this complication. But instead, you married me. You put everything on the line, your land, your reputation, your carefully built life, for 3 strangers who had no claim on you whatsoever. You're not strangers anymore." "No, we're not." She moved closer, and Cade felt his breath catch as she placed her hand over his heart, feeling it beat beneath her palm. "We're family. Really, truly family. And I know we got married for legal reasons. I know you said it didn't have to be real in the ways that matter. But Cade—" She looked up at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears and something else. Something that made his chest tighten with hope he'd been afraid to acknowledge. "It feels real to me. Has for a while now. And if you don't feel the same way, that's fine. I can keep it to myself. We can just continue as we have been." Cade cut off her rambling by doing what he'd wanted to do since the moment she'd stood in his kitchen with defiant tears on her face, defending those girls with every ounce of strength she possessed. He cupped her face in his rough, scarred hands and kissed her. It wasn't the chaste, brotherly kiss from their wedding ceremony. It was real and deep, and full of all the things he'd been too scared or too stubborn to put into words. When he finally pulled back, Violet was staring at him with wide eyes and parted lips. "It's real to me, too," he said quietly. "Has been since somewhere around the 2nd week, maybe earlier. I kept telling myself it was just strategy, just protection, just doing the right thing. But the truth is, Violet, I haven't felt this alive in years. Haven't wanted to come home to anyone the way I want to come home to you. You and those girls, you've made this house breathe again. Made me remember why I built this place to begin with." "Why did you build it?" Violet whispered. "For family. My parents raised 4 kids here, filled these rooms with noise and laughter and all the messy chaos of people who love each other. After the war, after I came back broken and angry, I thought I wanted silence and isolation, but what I really wanted was for it to feel like home again. I just didn't know how to make that happen alone." Violet's tears spilled over, tracking down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "So what do we do now? Now that the fighting's over and we won?" Cade thought about it. About the work that would need doing tomorrow and every day after. Fences to mend, cattle to tend, a garden that needed weeding, children who needed raising. He thought about the reality of marriage not as a legal strategy but as a daily choice, a constant negotiation, a partnership built on more than just necessity. Now we live, he said simply. We build something real and solid and permanent. We raise those girls together. We figure out what this marriage is supposed to look like when we're not in crisis mode. We make mistakes and fix them and keep going anyway. That sounds complicated. Probably will be. But I'm starting to think complicated is better than empty. He kissed her again, softer this time, a promise rather than a declaration. Stay with me, Violet. Not because you have to, not because it's legally convenient, but because you want to. Build this life with me, for real. Yes, she breathed against his lips. Yes, I want that. I want all of it. From inside the house came the sound of Poppy's voice, calling out that May was asking for one more story before sleep. Violet laughed and pulled away reluctantly. Duty calls, she said, but her eyes were shining. Go. I'll be there in a minute. Cade watched her disappear inside, heard her greeting the girls with warmth and affection, heard their excited voices telling her about some game they'd invented. The sounds of family, of home, of a life he'd stopped believing he could have. He remained on the porch a little longer, looking out at the land he'd fought to keep, the ranch he'd built from nothing. It looked different now somehow, not just property to be defended, but a foundation for something larger than himself. A place where broken things could be mended, where lost people could find belonging, where love could grow in the spaces between hard work and honest struggle. The stars were beginning to emerge, scattered across the darkening sky like promises. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There was always more work to be done on a ranch, always something needing attention. But tonight, everything was exactly as it should be. Cade headed inside to find Violet sitting on May's bed, book open in her lap, both girls curled up beside her listening with rapt attention. Poppy looked up as he entered and silently shifted over, making room. He settled onto the bed's edge, and without missing a beat in her reading, Violet reached out and took his hand. May's eyes were already drooping. Poppy fought sleep with characteristic determination, but was losing the battle. Violet's voice was soft and steady, weaving the story around them like a blanket. This was it, Cade realized. This ordinary, perfect moment. After all the fighting and fear and uncertainty, they'd arrived at something achingly simple. A family sitting together at the end of a long day, just being. When the story ended and both girls had finally surrendered to sleep, Cade and Violet tucked them in with practiced coordination, moving around each other with the ease of long partnership. They stood in the doorway for a moment, looking back at the girls, Poppy with one arm flung over her head, May curled around her doll, both of them safe and settled and home. Our girls, Violet whispered. Our girls, Cade agreed. And the word felt right in his mouth, felt true in a way that legal documents and judges' rulings never could be. They retreated to their own room, not separate rooms anymore, but the one they'd share, the one that would become theirs through accumulated nights and shared mornings and all the intimate mundanities of marriage. Violet hesitated at the threshold, suddenly shy despite everything that had been said between them. Are you sure, she asked quietly, about all of this? About us? Cade pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. I've never been more sure of anything. You're mine, Violet Rockwell, and I'm yours. For real this time. No more pretending it's just strategy or convenience. No more pretending, she agreed, and kissed him again, sealing the promise. Outside, the Texas night stretched endlessly in all directions, full of possibility and promise. The ranch settled into its evening rhythms, familiar and solid, and inside the house that had been silent for so long, 4 hearts beat in comfortable synchrony, building something that no judge's ruling or legal battle could ever truly define. They'd won more than custody today. They'd won the right to be a family, messy, complicated, unconventional, but undeniably real. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The next morning, Cade woke to the sound of May's laughter drifting through the house and Violet's voice singing softly in the kitchen. He lay in bed for a moment, just listening, letting the reality of it all sink in. Then he rose and joined his family,